Hey guys, tonight we are going to ease ourselves into a world that feels to our modern ears almost impossibly quiet. Imagine stepping back not just centuries, but into a state of existence where the loudest thing you hear for hours on end might be the flutter of a pigeon's wings in the rafters or the distant rhythmic thud of a hoe in the garden soil. We're trading the constant hum of electronics, the traffic roar, the notification pings, and the general cacophony of everyday life for the deliberate, almost sacred hush of a medieval monastery. It's a place built for contemplation, for routine, and for listening to things far subtler than most of us ever notice. In fact, the silence was so profound, you might find yourself struggling to stay awake just from the sheer lack of stimulation. You probably won't survive this without drifting off, and honestly, that's the point. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now, down in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing just inside the great heavy doors of a stone building that has stood for centuries. The air is cooler here, carrying the faint, clean scent of old stone and perhaps a hint of beeswax from the candles burning somewhere deep within. Sunlight, if it's day, filters through high, narrow windows striping the dusty air. If it's night, the darkness is profound, broken only by the wavering light of lamps. The very act of your footsteps echoing slightly on the flagstone floor feels like an intrusion in the prevailing quiet. This is a medieval monastery. You see not just any old building, but a place where the deliberate suppression of noise was part of the spiritual discipline. Forget the bustling markets or the noisy taverns of the medieval towns. This is the opposite. This is where silence wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a presence in itself, a tool used by the monks who lived here day in and day out, following a routine laid down generations before. Think of it as the ultimate digital detox, but with less avocado toast and more early morning chanting in the cold. The normal soundscape of this place wasn't loud. It was structured, punctuated by specific, predictable noises that marked the passage of time and the rhythm of prayer and work. The most significant, of course, was the sound of the bells. Not the cheerful peal of a village church, but the deep, resonant tolling that called the community to the 8 offices of the day. Imagine the smallest hours of the morning still deep in pre-dawn darkness. The silence is broken by the slow, deliberate bong, bong, bong. That sound isn't just telling you the time, it's pulling you from sleep, telling you it's time for vigils or matins. The first prayer service often held long before the sun considers making an appearance. You'd hear the rustle of rough woolen habits as figures emerge from their cells, their bare or lightly sandaled feet shuffling along the cold stone corridors towards the church. The silence inside the church itself before the service would be thick, broken only by the occasional cough or sigh. Then the chanting would begin, Gregorian chant. Its monophonic meaning, everyone sings the same melody often without instrumental accompaniment. It rises and falls, a smooth flowing sound, filling the vast space of the church. It's not performance, it's prayer set to music designed to be calming, meditative, and focused entirely on the words of the Psalms and Scriptures. You'd hear the collective breath draw in the steady stream of voices, the moments of silence between verses punctuated by the shuffle as the monks adjust their posture. This chanting would repeat throughout the day for lauds at sunrise prime, soon after tertius sexta none, during the day vespers, in the late afternoon, and finally compline before sleep. Between these periods of communal prayer, silence, or at least quiet, reigned supreme. The rule of Saint Benedict, which many Western monasteries followed, placed a strong emphasis on silence. Not absolute constant silence, that would be impossible, but a deliberate effort to avoid unnecessary talk, idle chatter, or loud noises. In areas like the cloister, the refectory dining hall, or the dormitory, silence was often mandatory. So what sounds did fill the gaps? In the scriptorium, where monks copied manuscripts, you'd hear the rhythmic scratch of quills on parchment, the soft turning of pages, maybe the occasional sigh of concentration. In the gardens or fields, the sounds would be those of manual labor. The scraping of hoes, the snip of shears, the creak of a wheelbarrow, the grunts of exertion. In the kitchen, perhaps, the clatter of earthenware pots, The chop of vegetables, the gentle hiss of cooking over an open fire. Though even here noise was likely kept to a minimum compared to a modern commercial kitchen. The monastery buildings themselves would have their own sounds. The wind whistling through cracks or around corners, the drip of water in a damp corner, the scurry of rodents within the walls, a common if unwelcome sound, the distant lowing of cattle or bleating of sheep from the monastic farm. These were the natural background noises, the sounds of the structure and the surrounding environment, rarely loud enough to truly disturb the carefully cultivated quiet within. It's hard for us to fully appreciate this level of quiet. We live in a world saturated with sound. Even in our own homes, the refrigerator hums, the computer fan spins, distant traffic sighs, or our own devices demand attention. In the medieval monastery, the silence wasn't just a lack of noise. It was an active state. It was meant to clear the mind, to allow for contemplation, to make it easier to hear, as they believed, the still small voice of God. Imagine trying to meditate for hours a day in absolute quiet. For many of us, our own internal monologue would be the loudest thing we heard, and probably the most distracting. A historian once joked that monks must have had unusually quiet brains, or perhaps they were just better at ignoring them than I am when I'm trying to sleep. This emphasis on silence wasn't just spiritual, it was practical too. With limited artificial light, especially at night, and the need for focus during prayer and work, minimizing distractions was key. The layout of monasteries with enclosed cloisters and thick stone walls was designed not just for security, but also to dampen external sounds, creating an internal world of quiet reverence. Historians still argue whether the strict rules on silence were always perfectly adhered to, or if there was more quiet conversation and necessary communication than the rules implied. It's likely, as with any human community, that necessity and nature found ways around absolute silence, perhaps through approved sign language or whispered instructions during work. Monastic sign language is a quirky tidbit here. Many orders developed elaborate systems of hand gestures so monks could communicate basic needs and tasks like asking for bread or a knife without breaking silence. It's like ancient, extremely devout charades. The routine, the horarium, was incredibly rigid. You didn't decide when to wake up, the bells did. You didn't decide when to eat, the bells did. You didn't decide when to pray, the bells did. This structure, punctuated by the predictable sounds of the bells and the chanting, created a very stable rhythmic sound environment. It was a world away from the unpredictable bursts of noise in a town or the vast, untamed sounds of the wilderness. It was a contained, controlled soundscape designed to be predictable, minimal, and conducive to a very specific way of life. Even the tools they used were often designed to be quiet. The soft shoes or bare feet on stone floors, the use of parchment quieter to handle than paper, the simple, robust furniture that didn't creak or wobble much. Every element seemed to contribute to the overall atmosphere of stillness. You could probably hear a pin drop, if anyone was silly enough to drop a pin in a place where everything had its designated spot and purpose. Though finding a pin in the Dark Ages might be a different challenge altogether. So before anything out of the ordinary happens, this is the backdrop. A world defined by ritual and silence, punctuated by the deep tones of the bells and the rising cadence of sung prayer. You are settling into this routine, this quiet existence. You know the sounds you expect to hear, the bells, the voices, the gentle sounds of work, the natural creaks and groans of the ancient building itself. You know the long stretches where the loudest thing will be your own breathing or the soft rustle of your habit. It is by intention a peaceful, predictable, and profoundly quiet place to live. And into this predictable quiet, something unexpected begins to intrude. Something that doesn't fit the pattern. Something that starts small, almost imperceptible, blending at first with the expected sounds, but gradually asserting itself as something fundamentally alien to the rhythm of bells chant and quiet contemplation. But that comes later. For now, just feel the weight of the silence, the deep old quiet of the stone, the rhythm of the expected sounds. Let this calm, predictable soundscape settle over you, so you're there steeped in this deliberate quiet. The expected sounds are your anchors, the bells calling you, the rhythmic drone of the chanting, the faint sounds of work or natural creaks. You've adjusted to a world where a dropped book might sound like a thunderclap. It's a profound sensory shift, one designed to heighten your awareness of the subtle, both internal and external. And it's into this carefully curated quiet that something begins to feel off. It starts subtly, almost imperceptibly. A faint scratching, perhaps. You're copying a manuscript in the scriptorium, the only sound the soft scratch, scratch, scratch of your quill on parchment. It's late afternoon, the sun slanting low through the high windows, painting dusty gold bars across the floor. The air's cool still. And then from the wall near your desk, you hear it. A faint scritch. You pause your quill hovering. Was that? You listen. Nothing. You dip your quill, return to your work. Scratch, scratch, scratch. A moment later, scritch, scritch. Your first thought naturally is rodents. The old stone walls, the stored grain, the general antiquity of the place. Of course there are mice or rats living in there. It's a fact of life in medieval buildings. You've heard them scurrying overhead in the dormitory ceiling or rustling in forgotten corners of the pantry. It's unpleasant but not unusual, so you shrug internally and dismiss it. Just mice. But the sound persists and it's slightly different. Mice scurry and gnaw. This feels less purposeful somehow. More like a hesitant dragging sound, and it seems to stay in one place for longer. A faint, muffled scrape. You try to ignore it, focusing on the intricate, illuminated letter you're carefully rendering. Gold leaf needs concentration. Imagine trying to apply gold leaf with shaky hands because you think there's a ghost mouse in the wall. Not ideal for the historical record. Maybe it's the building settling. These structures are ancient, built with thick stone blocks held together with mortar that's seen centuries of weather. They groan and shift, particularly with changes in temperature or humidity. You've heard the old timbers creak in the roof on a windy night, or the stone walls seem to sigh under pressure. Perhaps this is just another one of the building's myriad acoustic personalities asserting itself. A sort of slow stone indigestion. You can rationalize it away. Your mind, conditioned by the predictable rhythm of monastic life, wants everything to fit neatly into the known categories of sound. But the subtle difference gnaws at you like a persistent, tiny insect you can't quite locate. The sounds don't move like mice do. They don't have the sharp, quick quality of claws or teeth. They are softer, more drawn out. And they seem to come not from the roof or the floor, but specifically from within. The solid thickness of the wall itself, about head height. You start to notice it at other times in other places, within the church and adjoining cloisters. During silent prayer in the choir stalls, when the quiet is so profound, you can hear the blood pulsing in your own ears. A faint whispering sound seems to emanate from the stone behind you. Not actual words, at least not at first, but a sibilant, airy noise that feels like breath against stone. It's so quiet, you wonder if you're imagining it, if the intense focus on prayer is making your senses play tricks. Maybe it's the wind outside finding a tiny fissure in the ancient masonry and sighing through it. That seems plausible. The wind makes all sorts of odd noises around old buildings. During the night office, vigils long before dawn, the church is lit only by flickering oil lamps and the cold light of the moon through high windows. The chanting rises and falls, echoing in the vast space. In the moments of silence between psalms, a faint, high-pitched sound seems to prickle at the edges of your hearing. It's not the familiar squeak of a bat in the rafters, you hear those sometimes, or the rustle of a monk shifting his weight. It's more taut, a thin, almost musical sound like a string vibrating under tension, but very, very quiet. You glance around in the dim light. Are other monks hearing it? Their faces, illuminated by the weak lamplight, show only the usual expressions of weary piety or focused devotion. No one else seems to react. You chide yourself. Lack of sleep, perhaps. The cold. Your imagination running wild in the dark. Mainstream historical fact time. Medieval monasteries, especially large ones, were often built over decades or even centuries using massive amounts of stone and timber, often quarried or felled locally. The sheer scale of construction, even with relatively simple technology compared to today, was immense and represented a huge investment of labor and resources. These were not flimsy buildings. They were designed to last, intended as enduring houses of worship and community for generations. So, the idea of them having natural structural groans and settling sounds is entirely accurate. The quirky tidbit, monks sometimes use small personal timekeeping devices in their cells like calibrated candles or water clocks, clepsydra, to help them estimate the time between the major prayer services, especially at night, even though the main bells were the definitive markers. So while the bells governed communal life, there were personal ways to experience time's passage, perhaps making one more attuned to the subtle changes in the monastery's ambient sounds during those long, quiet hours. Back to the sounds. They don't stop. They become a subtle background hum beneath the regular monastic rhythm. The faint scratching while you work, the almost whisper during prayer, the thin high note in the dead of night. They are still quiet, still easy to dismiss, still attributable to mundane causes. Mice wind building shifts your own fatigue, maybe even the creak of the scaffolding that might have been used years ago during construction or repairs somehow still embedded in the memory of the stone, but they start to feel wrong. They lack the randomness of natural sounds. They seem to occur in places where mice shouldn't be able to access the interior of the wall, or where the wind couldn't possibly penetrate. They also have a certain quality that doesn't fit the familiar. The scraping isn't the quick, nervous sound of rodent claws. It's slower, more deliberate, almost dragging. The whispering sound doesn't fluctuate like wind. It's steadier, a constant low sibilance. The high note isn't a sudden squeak. It's sustained, thin, and persistent. You find yourself pausing more often, tilting your head, trying to isolate the source. You tap the stone wall gently. It's solid, unyielding. No hollow spots that you can discern. You run your hand over the surface. Rough, cold stone. Nothing seems out of place. Historians still argue whether medieval monastic life was truly as strictly ordered and silent as the rules suggested, or if the realities of communal living, practical necessities, and human nature meant there was more interaction and less rigid silence than the formal documents imply. Perhaps small necessary conversations were common, or maybe the strict rules were more aspirational than consistently enforced. The point is, even if it wasn't 100% absolute silence all the time, the relative quiet compared to the world outside would have been profound, making any unusual noise all the more noticeable. You start listening more intently during the designated periods of silence, the long hours of sleep or attempted sleep in the dormitory, the contemplative reading time in the cloister. It's in these deep pockets of quiet that the sounds are most apparent, most intrusive. They seem to thrive in the absence of other noise asserting themselves when the bells are still and the chanting has ceased. There's a joke among scriptorium monks, delivered in whispers of course, about the resident bookworm ghosts who make the parchment rustle at night. You wonder if this is something similar, a known eccentricity of the old building, a sound passed down through generations that everyone just accepts as the walls creak or the winds lament. But something in your gut tells you this is different. It feels active, like something is making. The sound, not just the building passively responding to environmental forces. It's easy in the deep quiet for your mind to wander, to conjure up explanations, mundane or otherwise. Maybe it's just your ears adjusting to the silence, becoming hypersensitive to the faint background noises that were always there, just unheard before. Maybe you're tired. Maybe you're praying too hard and hallucinating, though hallucinating from too much prayer sounds like a paradox. Maybe it's a medieval version of runner's high. But for the soul, the key characteristic of these initial sounds is their elusiveness. They are never loud enough to demand immediate attention. They are always on the edge of hearing, easily mistaken for something else easily dismissed. They are frustratingly vague, refusing to resolve into a clear, identifiable noise. They are a presence felt more than heard, a suggestion of something unusual hidden within the familiar stone fabric of your home. And the subtle difference, the way they don't quite fit the pattern of expected sounds, is beginning to prickle at the back of your neck in the long, silent hours. It's a creeping unease, a faint dissonance in the carefully tuned harmony of monastic life. You find yourself straining to hear them, and then paradoxically wishing you hadn't. So you're trying to get back to the rhythm, right? You've told yourself it's mice, it's the wind, it's the old stones groaning under the weight of centuries and piety. You've successfully pushed the subtle weirdness to the back of your mind. Like that one psalm verse you can never quite remember the next line to. But the sounds, they didn't get the memo about your mental dismissal. They persist, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, they begin to escalate. It's not like they suddenly turn into a heavy metal concert inside the walls. Thankfully, medieval walls are pretty good soundproofing for, get that, It's more of an insidious creeping increase, that faint scritch you heard in the scriptorium. Now it's a slightly louder, more insistent scrape scrape. The barely there whisper in the choir stalls. It feels like it has just a little more presence, now a faint steady hiss that lingers just a fraction longer than you'd expect. The thin high note at night. It's not higher, but it seems to have gained a fraction of volume. A sort of quiet intensity that makes the hairs on your arms stand up, even in the cold church air. You find yourself catching your breath more often. You'll be walking down the cloister walk, the only sound your sandals on the worn flagstones, the gentle drip of water in the courtyard fountain, and there it is. A faint rhythmic thudding from the wall bordering the garth. Not loud, not enough to make you jump, but distinct enough that your steps falter. You freeze listening. Just the wind, maybe. Know the air is still. Someone working on the other side of the wall. Possible, but the sound isn't quite right for chopping wood or laying stone. It's contained. And it stops as suddenly as it started, leaving you standing there feeling vaguely foolish for having stopped at all. The rationalizations you clung to in Section 2 are starting to wear thin. When you heard the scratching before you thought mice, you'd mentally picture a little mouse family having a party in the plaster. Now the sounds are harder to fit into that neat little box. Mice are quick, they dart and scurry. This sound is slower, more deliberate. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It sounds less like tiny claws scrabbling and more like, well, you don't want to think what it sounds like. Something heavy, perhaps, dragging slowly against stone. And the locations. It's not just near the scriptorium wall anymore. You hear the faint, almost whispering sound near the altar in the main church nave during prayer. You hear the soft scraping from a different wall in the chapter house during a meeting. You hear the high taut sound, not just in the church at night, but perhaps faintly near your cell wall in the dormitory. It feels like the sounds are spreading, or maybe you're just becoming more attuned to them. Your senses now calibrated to detect this specific form of auditory intrusion. It's like you've accidentally activated a weird noise filter in your brain, and now you can't turn it off. Mainstream historical fact alert monastery churches were often built in stages, sometimes over many centuries, resulting in different architectural styles and potentially hidden cavities, blocked off passages or layered construction within the walls as additions or renovations were made. This complex history of building and alteration could theoretically create unusual acoustic properties or hidden spaces that might account for strange sounds. Though perhaps not these kinds of strange sounds, but we'll get there. The quirky tidbit monastic rules sometimes detailed surprisingly specific things, like how monks should walk, hold their hands, or even control their facial expressions to maintain decorum and avoid distraction. The idea was to cultivate an internal state of peace and focus through external discipline. Imagine trying to maintain that perfectly serene, neutral face while hearing faint, unidentifiable scraping coming from the wall right next to you during silent contemplation. That's a test of discipline. You find yourself listening during times when you absolutely shouldn't be. During Mass, when your focus should be entirely on the liturgy, your ear is straining towards the stone behind you. During communal reading, instead of absorbing the wisdom of the Church Fathers, you're trying to differentiate the sound of parchment rustling from that persistent low hiss. It's distracting. It's unsettling. And because these moments are supposed to be silent or filled with sacred sound, the intrusion feels particularly sacrilegious almost, like the building itself is harboring some kind of unsettling secret that is trying to make itself known at the most inappropriate times. Historians still argue whether medieval people were inherently more superstitious than modern populations, or if their different understanding of the natural world and greater acceptance of unexplained phenomena simply led them to interpret unusual events through a different cultural and religious lens. While we might immediately jump to structural issue or pest control needed, a medieval mind might be quicker to consider other possibilities, perhaps spiritual or supernatural. The sounds are no longer easily ignorable background noise. They are a presence that actively disrupts your concentration. You might be deep in prayer, feeling a sense of peace descending, and then a sudden, distinct thump from the wall jolts you back to nervous alertness. You're trying to sleep after a long day of labor and prayer, drifting off into welcome unconsciousness when a persistent faint scratching starts up again right near where your head rests against the wall of your cell. It's like a quiet, unwelcome guest who keeps tapping on your window at night. You try mentioning it casually, maybe to the monk sitting next to you in the scriptorium, Brother Thomas, who seems to have a knack for noticing small details. Did you hear that? You might whisper, carefully, eyes still on your work. He pauses, quill hovering. Hear what, brother? You hesitate, saying the wall sounds weird, feels silly. Oh, nothing. Just thought I heard a mouse. He shrugs, goes back to work. You wonder if he heard it too, but dismissed it, or if he truly heard nothing. The ambiguity is frustrating. Maybe it's not just you. You start watching others more closely during the silent periods. Do you see anyone else pause unexpectedly? Tilt their head, glance nervously at a wall. It's hard to tell. Everyone is so practiced at maintaining outward composure. Their faces are often serene or simply focused on their tasks. But sometimes you catch a fleeting expression, a flicker of unease in the eyes, a slight stiffening of the posture, that makes you wonder if they are hearing it too but are just as reluctant as you are to voice it. Maybe it's just your paranoia making you see things, or hear things. Another potential mundane explanation pops into your head drafts. Old buildings are notoriously drafty. Could the sounds just be air currents whistling through unseen gaps, vibrating loose pieces of stone or wood within the wall? It's possible. You try to locate a draft when you hear the sounds, but the air often feels still, and the sounds themselves don't always have the quality of whistling wind. They feel more solid, more grounded. The scraping sounds sometimes feel rhythmic now, albeit very slow and unevenly spaced. Not like a consistent beat, but a sequence. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause, scrape. It feels almost purposeful, which is a thought you try very hard not to dwell on. Purposeful implies something is doing it, and what could be inside a solid stone wall, making slow scraping sounds. There's a dark joke you might hear circulating in hushed tones in the more weary moments of the day, perhaps in the refectory before grace or during a break from manual labor. It's about the monastery being built on unhallowed ground or disturbing something ancient and grumpy beneath the earth. Morbid humor, of course, but as the sounds become harder to ignore, even these flimsy, unsettling jokes start to feel a little less like jokes and a little more like possibilities. You find yourself spending more time in the presence of others during silent periods like the scriptorium or the refectory, rather than solitary prayer in a quiet corner or reading in your cell. There's a strange comfort in knowing that even if you're hearing something unsettling, you're not entirely alone. Although the thought that others might be hearing it too and are just as confused or uneasy isn't exactly reassuring either. Misery loves company, but preferably company that has an actual solution, not just shared confusion. The increase in frequency and intensity is subtle but definite. The sounds are no longer fleeting anomalies. They are recurring events. They are weaving themselves into the fabric of the monastery's auditory landscape, but they are a discordant note. They are still quiet enough that you can tell yourself you're imagining things, but just loud enough, just persistent enough, just wrong. Enough that you can no longer fully believe that lie. You are entering a phase where rational explanation requires more and more mental gymnastics, and the simple truth that there are strange, unexplainable sounds coming from within the monastery walls is becoming increasingly difficult to avoid. The unease is no longer mild. It is growing, settling deep in your bones during the long hours of silence. So the subtle escalation is over. The sounds aren't just a bit louder now. They're becoming distinct. They are acquiring characteristics that make them harder to dismiss as mere ambient noise or tiny creatures. That faint scraping, it's now less like a mouse scratching and more like a slow, heavy drag. Scrap, drag, pause, scrap, drag. It has a weight to it, a kind of labored quality that prickles your skin. The high, thin note. It's not just thin anymore. It has a tautness, a sustained quality that feels less like a whistle and more like, well, you try not to think of it, perhaps like a wire pulled tight to the point of snapping or a single sustained pained note. And the thudding. Oh, the thudding. It's definitely not rhythmic footfalls anymore. It's uneven, sometimes muffled, sometimes startlingly sharp, like a solid object striking stone, but from within the wall. Surr thump, pause, thump thump, pause, thump. It sounds less like movement and more like impact, repeated impact, like someone or something is slowly, deliberately, or maybe desperately striking the inside surface of the stone. You find yourself pausing your work, your prayer, your walk to listen more intently. You press your ear cautiously against the cold stone of the wall where you heard a sound. It's quiet now. Of course it is. The sounds have a frustrating tendency to cease the moment you give them direct attention. It's as if they are shy or perhaps deliberate in their timing, only making themselves known when you are slightly distracted, slightly vulnerable to their intrusion. You try tapping on the wall, gently at first, just a light rap with your knuckles. Nothing. You tap harder. The solid sound of stone meeting bone. No answering sound from within. You listen again, your ear flattened against the rough surface. Nothing but the faint sound of your own heartbeat in your ears and the distant normal noises of the monastery. Footsteps on the flags, a door closing, the murmur of voices from the refectory. It's maddening. Are you imagining it? Is it some strange acoustic trick? But the sounds are so specific now. You start trying to pinpoint the locations more precisely. You know the scraping seems strongest near the base of the wall in the scriptorium annex. The high sound seems to emanate from a section of the wall near the east window in the choir. The thudding is often heard near the junction of two different building phases. Where the original structure meets the later addition, perhaps you mentally map the locations of the sounds, creating a disturbing, invisible geography of noise within the monastery walls. It's like a very unwelcome, very slow-motion treasure hunt, but the treasure is just increasing levels of dread. Mainstream historical fact medieval monasteries were often constructed using a core of rubble and mortar faced with dressed stone. This method, while efficient, could create internal cavities, passages, or inconsistent structures within the walls. Later additions or renovations might have sealed off existing spaces, potentially leaving voids or hidden chambers that are now inaccessible. This layered, sometimes haphazard construction could easily lead to unpredictable acoustics or create spaces where sounds could originate without an obvious external source. The sounds are starting to affect more than just your concentration. They're getting into your sleep. You might fall asleep exhausted after matins or vespers, only to be jolted awake by a sudden sharp thwack from the wall near your head. Or you'll lie awake for hours straining to hear over your own breathing, waiting for the slow, deliberate scrap, drag to start again, and dreading it when it does. Sleep, that precious monastic respite, is becoming yet another arena for this unsettling phenomenon. It's like the walls themselves are determined to rob you of peace day and night. You notice you're not the only one showing signs of fatigue. There are darker circles under eyes, more yawns during communal prayers. A general air of low-grade anxiety seems to be settling over the community, though no one is explicitly naming the cause. Could others be experiencing this too? Or is your own obsession with the sounds making you project this anxiety onto everyone else? You decide you have to talk about it more openly now. The casual hints didn't work. You seek out Brother Joseph, who's been here the longest, known for his steady temperament and practical mind. You corner him quietly in the cloister garden during a moment of shared silence. Brother Joseph, you begin hesitantly, keeping your voice low. Have you noticed anything unusual lately? Sounds. He pauses, tending to a struggling rose bush. He doesn't immediately dismiss you. He straightens up slowly, turning to face you, his expression thoughtful. Sounds, brother, he asks. What kind of sounds? You feel a surge of hesitant hope. He didn't laugh. He didn't look at you like you were mad. From inside the walls, you clarify, feeling suddenly foolish again, but pushing through it. Scraping, thudding, a high sound sometimes. He looks away toward the ancient stones of the church wall bordering the garden. He's silent for a long moment. Then he speaks, his voice soft. The old stones groan sometimes, brother. Buildings settle. There are mice, and the wind finds its way through cracks. It is an old place. It's a dismissal, but it's delivered gently, kindly. It's the standard explanation, the rationalization that you yourself clung to not so long ago. But there was something in his pause, in the way he looked at the wall, that makes you wonder if he has heard something and is choosing or needing to explain it away. Or maybe he just doesn't want to indulge what he thinks is your overactive imagination. Another gentle joke that makes the rounds, maybe from the younger, less serious brothers, goes something like this. Heard the walls talking again last night. Probably just Brother Giles snoring in the next cell, shaking the foundation. You try to laugh along, but the joke lands flat for you now. Because the sounds you hear are definitely not snoring, unless Brother Giles has somehow managed to embed himself deep within the masonry. The quirky tidbit, medieval monks, despite their devout focus, were also practical people engaged in the day-to-day management of often large estates. They kept detailed records, managed finances, oversaw building projects, and engaged in agriculture and various crafts. They weren't solely cloistered mystics. They were administrators, farmers, builders, and scholars. This blend of the spiritual and the practical meant they were used to dealing with worldly problems, but also constantly sought spiritual meaning in their experiences. How do you apply practical problem solving to a sound coming from inside a solid wall when practical solutions like find the source or call the pest control seem impossible? You find yourself wanting to talk about it constantly, but restraining yourself. Mentioning it too much might lead to you being seen as troubled, perhaps sent for counseling with the abbot, or worse, seen as a disruptive influence. So you keep it mostly to yourself, turning the problem over and over in your mind during silent prayer, during solitary walks, during sleepless nights. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of belief in miracles, demons, and divine intervention in the Middle Ages made people less inclined to seek natural explanations for unusual phenomena, or if their rigorous intellectual traditions, rooted in classical learning, actually encouraged a form of proto-scientific inquiry alongside their faith. Did a monk hearing strange sounds in the wall immediately suspect a demon? Or did he first consider structural issues, pests or drafts, only turning to the supernatural when natural explanations failed? Your own internal debate mirrors this historical question. You desperately want a natural explanation, but the sounds are making it increasingly difficult to find one that fits. The slow, dragging scrape is now accompanied sometimes by a faint rhythmic bumping, almost like something heavy is being dragged across an uneven surface, punctuated by impacts. The high sound occasionally warbles or shifts pitch slightly, making it sound less mechanical and more biological. And the thudding can sometimes vary in intensity, sometimes soft, sometimes hard, sometimes rapid, sometimes slow, like someone is striking the wall with different levels of force, or perhaps with different parts of their body. You start paying obsessive attention to the walls themselves. You examine the stone blocks, looking for cracks, for loose mortar, for any sign of disturbance. You trace the lines between the different building phases, wondering about hidden spaces or unstable areas. You tap gently on various spots, listening for differences in resonance, trying to find a hollow spot that might explain the contained nature of the sounds. You find nothing conclusive. The walls look solid, undisturbed, silent when you are actively investigating. You recall something you read in a text once about the acoustic properties of large stone buildings, how sounds can travel in strange ways, be amplified or muffled, depending on the architecture. Perhaps it's something like that, a sound from outside, a distant blacksmith perhaps, or work being done on a nearby building, is somehow being channeled and distorted through the stone. It's a comforting thought, but it doesn't quite explain the specificity of the sounds or their seemingly internal nature. It's also hard to imagine what external sound could possibly resemble a slow dragging scrape and intermittent thuds. The fear is no longer just a sudden jolt of surprise. It's a constant low-level hum beneath the surface of your consciousness. It's in the way you hesitate before walking down a quiet corridor, in the way your eyes dart towards the walls during silent prayer. It's in the tension in your shoulders, the slight tremor in your hands when you're trying to hold a quill steady. You are listening constantly, even when you are trying not to. The sounds have become a physical and mental burden, weighing on you, isolating you in your growing certainty that something is genuinely wrong, even if no one else seems to fully acknowledge it. Or perhaps they do acknowledge it in the quiet of their own minds and are just as afraid to speak of it as you were until now. The sounds are forcing the issue. They are demanding attention, and they are becoming harder and harder to ignore or explain away. The mundane is failing. The uncanny is creeping in. The quiet dismissal from Brother Joseph, gentle as it was, didn't extinguish the flame of your anxiety. It merely banked it, making it burn hotter internally. The sounds weren't ceasing. They were continuing their relentless, subtle assault on the quiet sanctity of the monastery and on your own rapidly fraying nerves. Each scrape felt heavier, each thud more deliberate, each high note more piercing. You couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was making these sounds was there, undeniably present, and it was doing something slow and arduous inside the very bones of the building. Sleeping remained difficult. The moments between prayer services, usually dedicated to quiet contemplation or necessary labor, were now filled with a constant low-grade tension, a background hum of listening. You found yourself snapping at novices more easily, your temper shorter than it should be. Your hands sometimes trembled when you were trying to illuminate a manuscript or pour wine during dinner. This wasn't just a personal disturbance anymore. It felt like a poison seeping into the community's well-being, even if many still seemed to be successfully ignoring or rationalizing the cause. The rational explanations were wearing thin, settling stone for sounds so varied and location-specific mice. Unless they were the size of small dogs and dragging heavy objects. Wind. How could wind make a rhythmic thud? You were running out of natural explanations, and the void they left was increasingly filled with a creeping sense of the unnatural. This was beyond your ability to cope with alone or with quiet, hesitant conversations with fellow brothers who seemed reluctant to engage. You needed to go higher. You needed to speak to the abbot. Approaching the abbot was no small matter. He was the spiritual father of the community, the ultimate authority within these walls. Your request for an audience would be filtered through the prior, and if granted, would take place in the formal setting of the abbot's private chambers or the chapter house. This wasn't a casual chat in the cloister. It required gravity, composure, and a clear purpose. You rehearsed what you would say in your mind during long hours in the scriptorium, the quill hovering over the vellum, the sounds from the walls, sometimes seeming to punctuate your mental script. You pictured the abbot. He was a man of stature, both physically and morally. Wise, devout, a firm but fair leader. He dealt with matters of spiritual discipline, administrative complexity, interactions with the outside world, bishops, nobles, merchants, and the overall welfare of the community. Your concern about sounds in the walls felt in rehearsal almost trivial compared to the weightier issues he surely handled. Would he dismiss you out of hand? Would he see it as a sign of spiritual weakness on your part, a lack of faith causing you to be susceptible to strange fancies? Despite the apprehension, the need to speak outweighed the fear of dismissal. The alternative was to continue living with this growing terror alone, while the sounds potentially escalated further. You decided the risk was necessary. You approached the prior after Vespers, stating your need to speak with the abbot on a matter of some urgency concerning the monastery fabric. The prior, a lean man with sharp eyes, regarded you for a moment, then nodded curtly, saying he would convey your request. The waiting began. A day passed. 2. You were beginning to think the request had been ignored, that the prior had perhaps decided your urgent matter wasn't worth the abbot's time, or worse, had quietly dismissed you as troubled. Then a message came. The abbot would see you in his chambers after none the following day. Your stomach tightened. This was it. The abbot's chambers were sparse but comfortable, a step up from the monk's cells, reflecting his position. There was a simple table, a few chairs, shelves of books and scrolls. The air was quiet, scentless, save for the faint smell of beeswax from candles. The abbot sat behind his table, gesturing for you to sit. His expression was calm, attentive, but perhaps also a little weary. The burden of leadership was clear on his face. "Brother," he began, his voice low and measured, "you wish to speak with me on a matter of some urgency regarding the monastery fabric. Please speak freely." You took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. You began choosing your words carefully, trying to sound factual and rational, not hysterical. "Father Abbot," you started, "for some time now, I, and perhaps others, have been hearing unusual sounds emanating from within the monastery walls." You paused, watching his face for a reaction. It remained neutral, waiting. Encouraged, you continued, becoming more specific. "Not the usual sounds of an old building, Father. Not settling stone or drafts. These are distinct. A slow, dragging sound often near the scriptorium annex wall at the base. A high, thin, sustained note often near the east window in the choir. And thudding Father. Uneven, sometimes muffled, sometimes sharp, like repeated impacts, especially near the junction of the older and newer parts of the church. You described the locations you had mapped mentally. You described the timing, often when things were quiet, but also sometimes jarringly loud and unexpected. You described the quality of the sounds, the sense of labor in the scrape, the tension in the high note, the impact in the thuds. You spoke of the increasing frequency and clarity, how they seem to be getting louder, harder to ignore, harder to explain away. I have tried to find a natural cause, Father, you emphasized, looking for cracks, tapping on the walls, considering acoustics. But these sounds, they feel contained, Father, as if they are within the stone, not merely traveling through it. You hesitated, then pushed on, feeling the weight of your conviction. They are disturbing our peace, Father. Disrupting sleep, making concentration difficult. They feel wrong. The abbot listened intently, his gaze steady. He didn't interrupt. When you finished, there was a long silence. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers steepled. Mainstream historical fact. The abbot held immense authority within the monastic community. He was elected by the monks in theory, though often influenced by external powers, and served for life. His word was law within the monastery walls, overriding the commands of secular lords, or even sometimes local bishops in day-to-day matters. Monks took a vow of obedience to the abbot. Approaching him with such a potentially strange complaint was a significant act, relying on his judgment and willingness to act on something unusual. Sounds within the walls, the abbot finally said, his voice thoughtful. He didn't sound immediately dismissive, which was a relief. An old building, brother. Stone and mortar shift with the seasons. Vermin can gnaw and scratch in unseen cavities. He was offering the standard explanations, the ones you had already discarded. Father, you gently pressed, these do not sound like rats or mice. The scraping, it is heavy. The thudding, it is like a fist or something hard striking stone. And the high sound, it is not an animal sound. You knew you were venturing into territory that could sound fanciful, but you had to be honest about the nature of the sounds. He was silent again for a moment, considering your words. He didn't show fear or immediate alarm, but a kind of measured evaluation. You say others have heard these sounds, he inquired. You hesitated. Brother Joseph had been non-committal. Others had joked. Had anyone else seriously acknowledged them? I believe so, Father, you said carefully. There is a general restlessness, a difficulty with sleep amongst many. I have spoken with Brother Joseph, who acknowledged the old stones groan, but I sense he has heard more than he said. Others make jests about the walls talking, but the jests feel like a way to avoid the unease. The abbot nodded slowly. He understood the dynamics of the community, the ways in which monks might express unease indirectly. He rose from his chair and walked over to a section of the wall in his own chamber, pressing his hand against the stone. He closed his eyes for a moment, perhaps listening. Of course, the chamber was silent now. The sounds never performed on command. A quirky tidbit, medieval monastic infirmaries were places not only for treating physical ailments, but also sometimes for addressing mental or spiritual distress. Conditions that might be interpreted today as anxiety, depression, or even psychological responses to stress or trauma were often viewed through a combined lens of physical humor, imbalances, spiritual trial, or demonic influence. An abbot might suggest rest in the infirmary, increased prayer, or even mild physical remedies, herbal teas, poultices, for a monk reporting disturbing experiences like the ones you described, seeing them potentially as symptoms of melancholy or spiritual weakness rather than external phenomena. The abbot turned back to you. Brother, he said, his tone shifting, slightly becoming more pastoral. The devil is cunning. He seeks to disturb our peace, to sow discord and fear. Sometimes he uses illusions, plays on our minds, especially when we are tired or under spiritual strain. Have you been diligent in your prayers? Have you been practicing contemplative silence? You affirmed that you had, though you admitted the sounds made concentration difficult. This was the spiritual explanation, the test of faith angle. It was a plausible framework within the monastic worldview, But it didn't explain the physical reality of the distinct sounds, the locations, the sense of something being physically present within the walls. Historians still argue whether the sophisticated theological framework of medieval thought, with its detailed hierarchies of angels and demons, made people more likely to attribute unusual events solely to supernatural causes, or if it also provided a structured way to categorize and therefore attempt to understand such events, even if the ultimate conclusion was supernatural. Your own struggle mirrored this. Was this a test of faith requiring spiritual resistance? Or was it a physical phenomenon requiring investigation? Or could it be both? The abbot didn't immediately leap to exorcism or dramatic action. He was thankfully a man of some practicality. "I will speak with the prior," he said, "and with some of the older brothers. I will also spend some time in the areas you mentioned listening myself." This was a significant step. He was taking your complaint seriously enough to investigate personally. "In the meantime, brother, I urge you to redouble your prayers. Seek strength in God. Do not dwell on these sounds more than necessary. The enemy thrives on fear." He didn't dismiss your concerns outright, but he framed them within a familiar spiritual context, while also promising a limited, quiet investigation. He didn't order the walls torn down or immediately summon the bishop for an exorcism. It was a measured response, typical perhaps of a prudent leader. You felt a mixture of relief that you had been heard and disappointment that the abbot didn't seem immediately convinced of the sound's tangible reality or the urgency you felt. He saw it perhaps as a spiritual trial affecting some monks rather than a physical problem within the building. You thanked him, bowed, and left his chambers, the silence of the corridor feeling heavier now. You had done what you could. You had brought the matter to the highest authority. The ball, as they say, in the outside world you had renounced was now in his court. But the sounds you suspected were not going to wait politely for the abbot's investigation. They felt too persistent, too purposeful for that. And as you walked back towards the scriptorium, the faint distant sound of a muffled thud seemed to confirm your fear. Leaving the abbot's quiet chamber, the weight in your chest was a complex mix of relief and lingering apprehension. You had spoken your truth laid bare, the disquieting reality of the sounds. The abbot blessedly hadn't dismissed you outright. He had promised to look into it, to listen, to speak with others. This felt like progress, albeit slow and measured, like trying to drain a swamp with a single chalice. You clung to the hope that his authority, his steady presence might somehow unravel the mystery, or at least bring it into the light of communal acknowledgement. You returned to the rhythm of monastic life, the communal prayers, the work in the scriptorium, the simple meals in the refectory. You tried, as the abbot had advised, to redouble your prayers, to focus on the divine, to resist dwelling on the sounds. But trying not to listen is paradoxically a form of listening. Every moment of quiet contemplation, every silent hour in your cell, became an exercise in resisting the urge to strain your ears, to categorize the next scrape or thud that might emanate from the stone. And the sounds did continue. Unaffected by the abbot's quiet inquiries or your own spiritual efforts, they persisted. In fact, they seemed to gain confidence. The dragging scrape near the scriptorium annex felt heavier, slower, more deliberate, as if something massive was being moved along the floor, just on the other side of an impossible barrier. The high, thin note near the east window of the choir seemed to grow in intensity sometimes, holding for long, agonizing moments like a trapped bird shrieking, but sharper, colder. Wrong. And the thuds were the worst. They weren't just random impacts anymore. They sometimes seemed to follow a pattern, a slow, uneven rhythm like something working methodically, striking the wall, pausing, striking again. You noticed you weren't alone in reacting anymore. At first it had been subtle, a shared startled glance with another monk during Vespers, when a sharp thud echoed faintly from the church wall, quickly masked by the chanting. Then during a quiet hour in the cloister as the dragging sound started up, you saw Brother Thomas, usually serene and focused on his carving paws, with his chisel in midair, his head tilted, a flicker of unease crossing his face before he quickly resumed his work. The forced casualness was becoming harder to maintain. Whispers started, not the usual monastic gossip about who burnt the stew or whose illuminations were the most vibrant. These whispers were low, hesitant, spoken in the corners of the cloister or after Compline, when the monastery was settling into its deepest silence. "Did you hear that tonight?" one monk might murmur to another. "Near the north wall. Another might reply with a non-committal grunt, but the tension in their shoulders gave them away. The collective denial was cracking. It was during the midday meal in the refectory that it became undeniable. The reader was droning on from a sacred text, the only sound meant to fill the hall besides the quiet clinking of spoons. Suddenly, a series of loud, sharp raps echoed from the wall bordering the kitchen area. Rap, 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 rap. It was distinct, percussive, and loud enough to make several monks jump, one even dropping his spoon with a clatter. The reader faltered, his voice trailing off for a moment before he cleared his throat and resumed, perhaps a little faster than before. The abbot, seated at the high table, paused his eating, his eyes scanning the refectory, his expression unreadable, but you saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. This wasn't something that could be ignored anymore. It wasn't just your imagination or Brother Joseph's settling stone. These were clear, undeniable sounds heard by many simultaneously. The atmosphere in the refectory, usually one of quiet piety, was now thick with a palpable unease. Heads remained bowed, but eyes flickered towards the kitchen wall, then towards each other, a silent, shared question hanging in the air. What was that? The abbot's promised investigation, if it had occurred, hadn't yielded public results, and frankly, the sounds were now doing more to convince the community than any quiet inquiry could. You felt a strange mix of dread that things were escalating and a weary satisfaction that you weren't considered mad anymore. Though you were still far from being declared a prophet, at least people were looking at the walls now, not just at you with polite concern. A mainstream historical fact about monastic life, obedience was a cornerstone of the Benedictine rule, the most common rule followed by Western monks. Monks vowed obedience to their abbot, who represented Christ within the community. Challenging the abbot's judgment, even indirectly by highlighting a problem he hadn't solved, was a delicate matter. The spreading unease about the sounds put the abbot in a difficult position. Either acknowledge the extraordinary nature of the problem, or risk losing authority and control as the community's fear and speculation grew independently. The increasing frequency and intensity of the sounds started impacting daily life more significantly. Sleep became a luxury few could afford without interruption. Monks were seen yawning during matins, their eyes heavy. Concentration in the scriptorium was broken by unexpected noises that made quills jump, leaving blots on precious vellum. The serene atmosphere of the monastery, its very purpose built on quiet contemplation and ordered routine, was being slowly eroded by this unpredictable, unnerving intrusion. It was like living inside a drum that was being occasionally randomly, but increasingly frequently struck from within. If you thought trying to explain it to one skeptical person was hard, try living with it when everyone else is now also hearing it, but nobody has an answer. It's like a medieval version of a bad Wi-Fi signal. Everyone knows it's dropping out, but no one can figure out why. The abbot held chapter meetings more frequently. These were usually occasions for discussing monastic discipline, assigning tasks, or reading from the rule. Now there was an unspoken tension. While the sounds weren't explicitly discussed in the formal setting initially, perhaps the abbot was still hoping they would cease or be explained away, the atmosphere was strained. He spoke of the need for spiritual fortitude for resisting temptation and fear, clearly addressing the growing anxiety within the ranks without directly naming its cause. But the monks weren't stupid. They knew what was causing the fear. Their quiet conversations continued, evolving from hesitant acknowledgments to open speculation. Was it the building itself? Was there a structural problem, or was it something else? Something less natural? The isolation of monastic life, while fostering spiritual focus, could also amplify communal anxieties. Removed from the bustling world with its myriad distractions and explanations, the unexplained within the cloistered walls took on greater significance. You found yourself joining these conversations, no longer the lone, slightly obsessed voice. Other monks shared their experiences. Brother Francis had heard the dragging sound near the kitchen wall now. Brother Edmund was certain the high note was coming from inside the stone column near the altar. They compared notes on the timing, the locations, the quality of the sounds. There was a sense of collective vulnerability, but also a strange bond forming over this shared unsettling experience. It was like being in a secret society, except the secret was that the walls were apparently haunted, and the membership fee was crippling anxiety. A quirky or fringe tidbit, medieval theories of sound and architecture were often linked to acoustics within churches designed to amplify chanting and sermons. However, strange echoes, resonant frequencies, or sounds produced by wind interacting with specific building features were sometimes attributed to natural spirits, ghosts, or even subtle demonic activity, especially if they seemed unnaturally loud, persistent, or disturbing to the monastic peace. The idea that buildings could hold sounds or even psychic energy wasn't strictly confined to folklore. It sometimes brushed against early proto-scientific attempts to understand environmental phenomena within a spiritual or animistic framework. The abbot's initial strategy of quiet observation and spiritual guidance wasn't working. The sounds were too insistent, the fear too pervasive. You could see the pressure mounting on him. His private listening sessions you heard through the grapevine hadn't produced definitive results. For him, perhaps the sounds were coy, or maybe he, like Brother Joseph, before him subconsciously filtered them through rational explanations. But the collective experience of the community was becoming undeniable. There's an open scholarly debate phrase here. Historians still argue whether the communal living and shared psychological environment of medieval monasteries made them particularly susceptible to phenomena interpreted as supernatural manifestations, or if the documentation of such events simply reflects the monastics' greater literacy and focus on recording their internal and external experiences compared to the general population. Were the monks creating the phenomena through mass hysteria or psychological projection amplified by their close living quarters and spiritual focus? Or were they simply the best positioned and most likely to record the genuinely unusual occurrences within their environment? One evening just before Compline, the final prayer service of the day, a truly violent series of thuds erupted from the wall, dividing the choir stalls from the vestry. It wasn't the slow, rhythmic rapping from before. This was loud, forceful, rapid, like someone was furiously beating on the stone with something heavy. The sound stopped abruptly after maybe 10 seconds, but the effect was profound. Several monks gasped. One let out a small cry. The prior, a man known for his stoicism, visibly flinched. Even the abbot who was present looked visibly shaken, his face pale in the dim light. Silence descended, but it was a shattered silence filled with the echo of those furious impacts and the pounding of terrified hearts. This was beyond settling stone. This was beyond rats. This felt intentional, violent. The shared glance around the choir stalls wasn't a question anymore. It was a statement. We all heard that. What in God's name is happening? This incident felt like a turning point. The quiet investigation was over. The spiritual framing, while still relevant to medieval thought, was insufficient to explain away such a blatant physical assault on the monastery's peace. Something had to be done. The abbot, faced with the undeniable terror on the faces of his community, and likely disturbed by the sounds himself, now had to act decisively. The problem had moved from a potential spiritual trial for a few troubled monks to a clear present threat to the entire community, emanating from within the very walls meant to protect them. The time for whispering and quiet listening was past. Something required physical intervention, something loud, something that would reveal what was inside. And in a medieval monastery, physical intervention into the structure usually meant one thing: tearing down a wall. The air hung thick and heavy after those final brutal impacts. The shared terror in the choir was a raw, exposed nerve. You didn't need to exchange words, the wide eyes, the trembling hands clutching prayer books, the quick, shallow breaths. It all spoke volumes. This wasn't a creak, a rustle, or a distant drag. This was something solid, forceful, there. And it was angry. The abbot, recovering his composure remarkably quickly, given the circumstances, stood after Compline had concluded in a hushed, truncated manner. His face was still pale, but his voice was steady, carrying the weight of his office. He didn't address the sounds directly in front of the full community, perhaps maintaining a shred of decorum or control, but his message was clear. He announced a special immediate chapter meeting for the senior monks and others he deemed necessary. A clear signal that the ordinary rhythm was suspended, that a crisis had arrived. As the monks filed out, the usual quiet shuffle was replaced by a tense, urgent energy. Everyone knew what the meeting would be about. You, having been the initial persistent voice raising the alarm, were summoned. Walking towards the chapter house, you felt a weird mixture of vindication and profound dread. Vindication because the undeniable proof had arrived, validating your unsettling experiences. Dread because the sounds had been validated. If they were real, if they were that violent, what did that mean? And what were they going to find? The chapter house was a more formal setting than the abbot's private chamber. The senior monks, the prior brother Benedict, a stern, silent man, who was the abbot's right hand, the cellarer brother Simon, responsible for provisioning and temporal affairs, whose practicality sometimes bordered on cynicism, the sacristan brother Peter, who oversaw the church itself and its sacred vessels and whose fear was perhaps the most visible, were already assembled, seated on benches lining the walls. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment and fear, which isn't exactly a listed medieval incense, but should be. The abbot sat in his chair at the head of the room, his hands clasped on the table before him. He looked tired, the lines on his face deeper than usual. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He acknowledged the sounds, the terrifying intensity of the last volley. He spoke of the disruption to monastic peace, the growing fear in the community, the need for answers. Brother Simon the cellarer, ever the pragmatist, spoke first. Perhaps it is a structural issue, Father Abbot, a settling, a cracking of the ancient stone exacerbated by the recent heavy rains. He sounded hopeful, perhaps, grasping for a mundane explanation, like a drowning man for a straw made of stone dust. The prior brother Benedict shook his head slowly. I have supervised repairs on this building for 20 years, Brother Simon. I know the sounds of stone settling. This was not it. This was violent, percussive. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces. It sounded like something trapped, trying to get out. The silence that followed his words was profound. Trapped. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The sacristan brother Peter spoke in a hushed, trembling voice. I have heard the high keening near the altar for weeks now. I tried to ignore it, prayed against it, but it is persistent. And tonight was different. It is as if the very stones of the Lord's house are crying out. His fear was palpable, radiating outwards. Then it was your turn. The abbot looked at you, a flicker of something complex in his eyes. Perhaps regret for his initial skepticism, perhaps apprehension about what you would add. You spoke calmly, recounting your earliest experiences, the dragging, the rapping, the feeling of being watched or heard by something unseen. You described how the sounds had evolved, becoming more distinct, more intentional. You didn't speculate wildly. You simply reported what you had heard, what you had felt. You tried to convey the sheer wrongness of it all, the sense that this wasn't just a building problem or an animal problem, but something else entirely. A mainstream historical fact, monastic chapters were formal meetings where the abbot would address the community, read from the rule-assigned penances, and sometimes consult with the senior monks or the entire chapter on matters of importance affecting the monastery. While the abbot held ultimate authority under the rule, consulting with his senior monks or the full chapter was a common practice, especially for significant decisions that impacted the entire community or the monastery's resources. It provided council-built consensus, or at least understanding, and distributed the burden of responsibility. This meeting was clearly one of great importance. The discussion continued, oscillating between possible natural explanations, elaborate drafts creating strange acoustics, infestation by exceptionally large and aggressive animals, though the violence of the impact strained this theory to breaking point, even human intrusion quickly dismissed as impossible within the sealed walls at night, and the increasingly unavoidable implication of something unnatural, something spiritual. Demonic activity was whispered, ghosts were mentioned hesitantly, ancient curses were brought up from the dusty corners of folklore. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on the abbot. He listened intently, asked probing questions, observed the fear and uncertainty on the faces of his most trusted brothers. He knew that whatever was happening, ignoring it further, was no longer an option. The peace and spiritual focus of his monastery, his flock, were at stake. More than that, the perceived sanctity of the church building itself was under assault by these inexplicable, terrifying noises. He stood again, walking slowly to a window overlooking the moonlit cloister, his back to the room. The silence returned save for the rustle of robes and the sound of anxious breathing. When he turned back, his face was resolute though etched with weariness. "We have prayed," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We have listened. We have sought explanation in the natural order. And yet the disturbance persists and indeed grows more violent. To allow this fear to fester, to allow the heart of our monastery, the church itself, to be a source of terror rather than solace. This we cannot do." He looked at each monk and turned his gaze steady. "We cannot ignore this any longer. Whatever the source, be it natural or otherwise, we must find it. We must expose it to the light or understand its nature so that we may either rectify it or confront it with the full spiritual might of this community." Then came the difficult words, the ones that made a chill trace its way down your spine, not entirely from fear of what lay hidden, but from the sheer magnitude of the task. "Therefore, Nari," the abbot stated, "I have decided. We must physically investigate the source of these sounds. Starting tomorrow, we will begin to breach the wall from which the most violent noises have emanated." A collective intake of breath filled the room. Breaching a wall in a stone monastery was no small undertaking. These buildings were built to last centuries, their walls thick and solid, composed of heavy stone and mortar, often structurally integral to the entire edifice. It wasn't like knocking through a plasterboard wall to see what was rattling inside. This was demolition requiring tools, labor, and risking the integrity of the structure itself, if not done carefully. It was a measure of absolute last resort, akin to performing surgery on a beloved but ailing body. It was the medieval equivalent of deciding to jackhammer your basement floor because you think you hear a faint scratching sound, only about 1,000 times more difficult and consequential. Brother Seaman, ever practical, immediately frowned. "Father Abbot, the tools, the labor, it will require substantial effort. And where precisely shall we begin? The sounds have been heard in different locations." "We begin where the sounds were loudest and most violent tonight," the abbot replied, his gaze fixed, as if seeing the section of wall in question. "The wall bordering the vestry from the choir, and we will proceed carefully, one stone at a time if necessary, until we find something." The discussion shifted to the logistics. Which tools could be used? Chisels, mallets, perhaps, even a small crowbar, if one could be sourced. Who would undertake the labor? It would require strong backs and careful hands. The monks were scholars and farmers and artisans, not necessarily demolition experts. It wasn't exactly a job listed in the Rule of St. Benedict. Chapter 48 of Daily Manual Labor. And if the wall starts screaming, grab a hammer and see what's up. There was a quirky or fringe tidbit often discussed in medieval architectural circles, though less in theological ones, the idea that large stone structures, especially those built on ancient or unconsecrated ground, could sometimes hold or amplify certain energies, or even trap the spirits of those who might have died tragically during their construction or prior. There were even folk beliefs about foundation sacrifices. Burying animals, or sometimes in darker legends, humans within the walls to appease spirits of the land or ensure the building's stability, which could lead to hauntings if improperly done. While not mainstream doctrine, such ideas circulated in the general consciousness and might have added an unspoken layer of unease to the task ahead. Were they about to uncover not just a physical void, but some ancient sealed horror? The abbot assigned the task to a small group of monks deemed physically capable and possessed of steady hands, including yourself. Your initial report and persistence, combined with your evident familiarity with the sound's locations, made you an obvious, if slightly terrifying choice. Your role was to be present to guide them to the precise locations where the sounds were strongest, as they worked, essentially becoming the monastery's chief sound consultant for their impromptu demolition project. You probably wouldn't get a consultant fee, just more anxiety and the potential to witness something deeply disturbing. The decision was made. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was now channeled into a concrete, albeit daunting task. The helplessness was replaced by a sense of grim purpose. They were going to find out. They were going to face whatever was making those sounds, even if it meant literally dismantling their sacred space stone by stone. There's an open scholarly debate phrase relevant here. Historians still argue whether decisions like this, seemingly drastic from a modern perspective, demonstrate the practical problem-solving approach of medieval monastics when faced with inexplicable phenomena, or if they highlight the extent to which superstitious beliefs and communal fear could drive potentially damaging actions based on speculation rather than concrete evidence. Was the abbot making a rational decision to investigate a perceived threat using the means available? Or was he caving to mass panic and potentially damaging valuable property based on fear of the unknown? It's a tricky line to walk, especially when the unknown is pounding violently on your walls. Leaving the chapter house that night felt different again. The monastery, usually a haven of predictable routine and quiet contemplation, was now humming with a suppressed tension, a shared anticipation of what the next day would bring. The sounds were no longer just a source of fear. They were a target, a mystery waiting to be uncovered, potentially with hammer and chisel. Sleep, you suspected, would be even harder to come by tonight, filled with dreams of hammers striking stone and the echoes of screams, real or imagined, trapped within the ancient walls. You were going to participate in the breaking of the silence, literally. The morning light, when it finally filtered through the high church windows, seemed less comforting than usual. It illuminated dust motes dancing in the air. Yes, but also the grim determination on the faces of the monks who had been tasked with the wall breach. Sleep had been fitful for you, haunted by the violent echoes of the previous night and the unsettling thought of disturbing ancient stone that had stood silent for centuries. The air in the monastery felt different, heavier, charged with an unspoken tension that overshadowed the usual morning rhythm of prime and lauds. Gathering the tools was a process in itself. Chisels, heavy mallets, a small iron crowbar that usually resided in the monastery workshop for stubborn nails or repair sturdy wooden wedges. None of these were instruments of peace or contemplation. They were tools of force, of necessary destruction, alien to the delicate work of illuminating manuscripts or tending quiet gardens. The sight of Brother Thomas, a gentle soul known for his beautiful calligraphy, hefting a heavy mallet felt fundamentally wrong, like watching a kitten try to move a boulder. You half expected him to drop it on his foot, which would at least be a slightly less terrifying problem than whatever was behind the wall. You led the small group to the designated spot, the section of wall separating the main choir stalls from the monastery's vestry. On the choir side, it was plain gray stone, unadorned, save for a simple stone bench built into its base, where monks might rest before or after services. On the vestry side, it would likely be the same, perhaps with wooden cupboards built against it to store vestments and sacred vessels. It looked utterly solid, utterly impervious. Medieval masons didn't mess around. These walls were built to keep things in and out for 1,000 years. Breaching it felt like an act of defiance against time itself. The abbot arrived to observe the start of the work, his presence a silent underscore of the gravity of the situation. He offered a brief, solemn prayer for safety and for the successful uncovering of the truth, whatever it might be. Then, with a nod to Brother Benedict, who would oversee the physical work, he stepped back, his face a mask of worry and resolve. Brother Benedict the prior took charge. He was a practical man, his hands calloused from years of managing the monastery's physical resources. He directed where the first blows should fall, not directly in the center of where the sounds had been strongest, but slightly lower, and to one side, creating a manageable starting point without immediately jeopardizing any potential structural keystone, if they could help it. The idea was to make a controlled opening, not just smash randomly. The first blows landed with a shocking crack and thud against the thick stone. The sound echoed loudly in the quiet choir, a harsh counterpoint to the usual silence. Dust immediately puffed into the air, smelling of old stone and decay. It was slow, painstaking work. The mortar between the stones, hardened over centuries, resisted the chisels. The stones themselves were heavy, fitted tightly together. Each chip, each small fragment of mortar dislodged was a minor victory, requiring significant effort. You stood slightly back, straining your ears, trying to match the faint residual echoes of the previous night's violence with the physical reality of the wall before you. "Here," you murmured to Brother Benedict, pointing to a specific area as they cleared the first few inches of depth. The sharpest impact, the feeling of something against the stone. It felt strongest right here. Brother Benedict nodded, directing the monks to focus their efforts on that spot. Brother Thomas, despite his earlier awkwardness, proved surprisingly diligent, his rhythmic mallet strokes chipping away with focused energy. Brother Michael, a monk known for his strength, but also his nervous disposition, worked with sweat beading on his brow, glancing nervously at the wall as if expecting it to suddenly fight back. The dust thickened the air, coating everything in a fine gray film. The rhythmic chip-chip thud of the tools was now the dominant sound in the choir, replacing the usual sacred quiet. It felt profoundly invasive, like performing surgery on the heart of the monastery. You couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of anticipation and guilt. Violating this sacred space, albeit with the abbot's blessing, felt like a necessary sacrilege. A mainstream historical fact. Medieval monastery walls, particularly load-bearing ones in significant structures, like churches, were incredibly thick, often several feet deep. They were typically constructed using rubble and fill, smaller stones, gravel and mortar packed into the core, faced with carefully dressed larger stones on the interior and exterior. The mortar was usually lime-based, which hardened significantly over time, making demolition a substantial undertaking requiring brute force and persistence. These walls weren't just partitions. They were integral parts of the structural integrity, supporting vast stone arches and heavy timber roofs. As they worked deeper, chipping away at the outer layer of dressed stone and beginning to encounter the packed rubble core, the sounds they were making drowned out everything else. You listened intently, trying to discern if there was any response, any subtle shift in the silence beyond their own clamor. But there was nothing. It was just the relentless scrape, tap, chip, thud. Brother Simon the cellarer came by later in the morning bringing water. He watched the dusty, laborious work for a moment, his pragmatic expression tinged with concern. "Making progress, I see," he said, though the small opening they'd made barely seemed significant against the vast expanse of the wall. "Find any hidden treasures yet? Perhaps a king's ransom hidden by nervous abbots during Viking raids?" He attempted a joke, but it fell flat in the tense atmosphere. There was no humor in this dirt and effort. Brother Benedict wiped sweat from his brow with a dusty hand. "Only more stone, Brother Simon. More mortar. It's slow going." "Show in the sounds?" Simon asked, looking at you. You shook your head. "Nothing since we started. The noise of the work, it's too much. Or perhaps..." You trailed off, not wanting to speculate that the thing had gone silent, sensing their intrusion. There was a quirky or fringe tidbit related to medieval wall construction that sometimes surfaced in local lore, the practice of burying objects within walls during construction. While sometimes mundane, a builder's forgotten tool, a coin, there were stories of intentional inclusions, protective charms, sometimes even witch bottles containing hairpins and urine sealed within walls to ward off evil spirits or curses. More unsettlingly, legends sometimes spoke of foundation sacrifices or burials to appease spirits of the land or ensure stability. Though documented evidence for such practices, especially within church walls, is rare and often tied to folklore rather than fact. The thought of what might be embedded deep within this ancient structure, placed there deliberately or accidentally centuries ago, added another layer of unease to the dust and effort. As the morning wore on, the hole deepened. They had removed the face stone from an area roughly 2 feet square and were now digging into the packed rubble and mortar behind it. This was where the real work was. The infill was a chaotic mix of smaller stones, broken bits of tile, and thick, incredibly hard mortar. It had to be chipped away, piece by agonizing piece. The air grew thicker with dust, making breathing difficult. Your clothes were coated in gray powder. You felt like you were slowly becoming part of the wall yourself. Brother Benedict, despite his experience, seemed surprised by the sheer density and haphazard nature of the infill. "They didn't skimp on the mortar," he grunted, levering out a particularly stubborn chunk of rock embedded in the matrix. "It's almost solid stone all the way through." Troy, this highlighted an open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the apparent variability in medieval wall construction techniques, from neatly coursed stone with minimal infill to thick walls heavily reliant on dense rubble cores, reflects differing regional practices, the availability of materials, the skill level of the masons, or perhaps even structural compromises made during the long and costly building processes. Was this particular section of wall built with unusual solidity because it was a critical point, or simply because that's how the masons on that day chose to work, stuffing it full of whatever rubble was handy and drowning it in mortar? It felt like the latter. A messy, effective solution to making a very thick, very solid wall. Hours passed. The sun arched higher, then began its descent. The monks labored on their faces, grim and streaked with dust. Breaks were taken only for water and a brief, hurried meal. The hole was now perhaps 3 feet deep and expanding slowly outwards. They were well within the core of the wall, now surrounded by ancient darkness and the smell of damp earth and stone. As they worked, you kept listening, straining your senses beyond the immediate noise. Had you imagined it? Or was there beneath the scrape of chisels and the thud of mallets a faint, almost imperceptible pressure? A sense of something resisting not just the physical stone, but the act of violation itself. You couldn't be sure. It was too subtle, too easily dismissed as fatigue or anxiety playing tricks on your mind. Late in the afternoon, just as weariness was truly setting in, and the light in the choir was beginning to dim, Brother Michael, working with a chisel at the bottom of the opening, stopped. He paused, his mallet raised, head cocked. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice hoarse with dust. Everyone froze. The rhythmic work stopped. Silence, thick and heavy, fell over the choir. You strained your ears. Nothing. Just the pounding of your own heart in the sudden quiet. "Hear what Brother Benedict?" asked, his voice low. Brother Michael looked uncertain. I thought I heard something. Like a scraping. But from inside," he gestured vaguely at the depth of the hole. "Deeper in." You hadn't heard it. Or had you? Was it the same subtle pressure you had felt? Was it the sound of movement within the wall's core, disturbed by their intrusion? Or was it simply the sound of a tired, fearful mind playing tricks in the dust and the dimming light? "Probably just the stone shifting," Brother Simon said dismissively, though he too looked uneasy. "Or dust falling." Brother Michael didn't look convinced, but he lowered his mallet and prepared to resume work. "Wait," you said, stepping forward cautiously. You knelt by the edge of the hole, peering into the dusty gloom of the excavation. You placed your hand gently against the rough, exposed rubble core. You felt the coolness of the stone, the gritty texture of the ancient mortar. You closed your eyes, trying to filter out the lingering echoes of their work, trying to feel, to hear, what Brother Michael thought he'd heard. For a long moment, there was only silence, the quiet breath of the monastery settling in for the night. Then, faint, almost swallowed by the depth of the wall, you felt it. A tiny, almost imperceptible vibration beneath your fingertips. And perhaps, just perhaps, the faintest suggestion of a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone far inside the wall's heart. It was too faint to be sure, too ambiguous to shout about, but it was something. Something that made the hairs on the back of your neck prickle. You pulled your hand back slowly. "Keep going," you said, your voice quiet. "Keep digging. I think you're getting closer." The implication hung heavy in the air. Closer to what they didn't know. But the dust, the effort, the violation of the ancient wall, it felt like it was leading them somewhere. Somewhere deep inside the stone, where screams had been heard and perhaps where something still waited. The work continued, the sounds of hammer and chisel resuming, but now with a renewed, almost desperate urgency. They were no longer just digging, they were excavating a mystery. The quiet moment after Brother Michael's hesitant whisper, stretch filled only by the heavy breathing of the monks, the faint clinking of tools resting on stone, and the persistent, gritty smell of ancient dust. You held your breath, listening, straining every nerve, feeling that faint vibration beneath your hand against the cold, rough rubble core. Was it real? Or was the exhaustion, the tension of the day, the sheer wrongness of digging into a church wall, finally getting to everyone? It was easy to imagine things in the dimming light, to project your fears onto the silence. Your brain, tired and wired, was probably inventing phantom sounds like a toddler looking for monsters under the bed. But the feeling of that subtle vibration remained a tiny tremor against your fingertips, distinct from the settling of dust or the distant sounds of the monastery. It was like holding your hand against a massive, inert body and feeling a tiny internal twitch. Brother Michael, though he hadn't felt the vibration, had heard something, a scraping. Two separate senses, two different perceptions, pointing towards the same unsettling conclusion. The wall wasn't just stone and mortar. There was something inside. It's probably nothing, Brother Simon said again, trying to sound confident. but his eyes darted nervously toward the dark opening. Old buildings settle, dust falls, it makes noises. He was probably right. Most strange noises in old houses or monasteries are just the house itself, breathing, shifting, complaining about the indignity of still standing after so many centuries. Like your back after sleeping on an old mattress. Plenty of creaking and groaning, but usually nothing sinister. Perhaps Brother Benedict agreed, but his voice lacked conviction. He looked from Brother Michael's pale face to your own, then back to the hole. He had spent his life surrounded by the predictable rhythms of the monastery, the quiet peace of prayer and work. This felt profoundly unpredictable. We should keep working, you urged, pulling your hand away and standing up, dusting off your knees. Whatever it is, we need to see it, or prove there's nothing there. Proving there was nothing there felt like the vastly preferable outcome, but deep down you suspected that wasn't going to be the case. The universe, it seemed, was rarely that kind, especially when it came to historical mysteries involving screams in church walls. The monks, though weary, resumed their labor. The rhythmic chip-chip thud filled the choir again, perhaps slightly faster now, fueled by a mix of dread and a desperate desire to get it over with. Brother Thomas, surprisingly strong for his gentle demeanor, swung his mallet with grim efficiency. Brother Michael, despite his earlier fear, seemed galvanized by his perceived sound, chipping away with furious energy, perhaps hoping to expose the source of his anxiety and make it less terrifying in the light. The rubble core was stubborn, a chaotic mix of small, irregularly shaped stones, chunks of broken tile, and an unholy amount of incredibly hard mortar. It was like trying to dig through concrete that someone had randomly stuffed with rocks. The dust was a constant choking presence, clinging to sweat coating your tongue, making the air thick and cloying. Visibility within the deepening hole was poor, even with the aid of a small oil lamp. One of the monks held steady its flickering flame, casting dancing shadows that seemed to twist the rough surfaces into menacing shapes. They were working in the rough area you had indicated where the feeling of impact had been strongest the night before. As they excavated deeper, you could feel the subtle change in the air pressure around the hole. It was faint at first, but it was there. A slight, almost imperceptible coolness, a different quality to the stale, dusty air they were displacing. It suggested they were approaching a void, a pocket of space, within the wall rather than just solid infill all the way through. A mainstream historical fact. While the core of medieval walls was often filled with rubble and mortar, larger voids were sometimes intentionally included for various reasons. These might be narrow passages, mural passages, small chambers for access to windows or roofs, or even larger hidden rooms, sometimes called priest holes. Though those were more common in later periods and often in domestic settings for hiding Catholic clergy during persecution. Finding a void within a church wall wasn't necessarily sinister, but the context here, the screams, made any such discovery deeply ominous. It was one thing to find a forgotten access passage. It was another entirely to find a space that had seemingly contained something alive and in distress. Hours bled into one another. The light outside the high windows faded entirely, and the choir was illuminated only by the faint glow of the lamp and a few strategically placed candles. The air grew colder, the physical effort of the digging the only source of warmth. The sounds of the monastery winding down for the night, distant chanting from Compline, the closing of doors, the muffled sound of footsteps, seemed to recede, leaving them isolated with their task in the ancient stone. You tried another gentle joke, needing something to break the tension. Well, if we don't find anything else in here, you coughed, the dust catching in your throat. At least we'll have enough rubble to build a really impressive rock garden, maybe even a little gargoyle out of the bigger bits. Brother Thomas managed a weak, dusty smile, but Brother Michael just grunted, his face set in concentration. Okay, maybe not the time for gardening jokes. Noted. Then sometime in the deep twilight, it happened. Brother Benedict, working with a crowbar to lever out a particularly large, stubborn stone embedded in the core, suddenly felt the tool slip slightly. The stone didn't just come loose, it seemed to move into empty space behind it. "Hold!" he called out, his voice sharp. Everyone stopped. The sudden silence was jarring after hours of relentless noise. Brother Benedict carefully probed the area with the crowbar. It went deeper than expected, meeting no resistance. There's a gap, he said, his voice hushed. Right here. The infill isn't solid. Working carefully now, the monks began to clear away the loose rubble and mortar around the edges of the gap. The opening, previously just a rough excavation, began to reveal the edge of a distinct cavity. It wasn't a vast space, but it was clearly there. A pocket of darkness hidden within the centuries-old wall. And then as they widened the breach slightly, a new smell emerged. It wasn't the dry mineral smell of ancient stone or the musty odor of old mortar. This was different. It was heavy, cloying, and deeply unpleasant. It smelled damp and stale, and like something that had been shut away for a very, very long time. A smell that made your stomach churn slightly, a smell that spoke of decay and stagnation, like finding an old fridge that had been off for a year, filled with forgotten leftovers. But worse, much, much worse. A quirky or fringe tidbit that might come to mind in this moment: there's an odd historical practice sometimes recounted in folklore or obscure texts of sealing objects or even bodies within buildings as a form of boundary mark or curse, or perhaps even a strange localized form of ritual offering to bind the structure to the place. While usually attributed to older pagan practices or very localized superstitions, the idea of something deliberately sealed within a wall, especially within a sacred building where such actions would be profoundly transgressive, adds a chilling dimension to the discovery of this void and its awful smell. The smell hung in the air, thick and nauseating. It made the exhaustion and dust seem trivial. This was the smell of something wrong. The monks recoiled slightly, covering their mouths with dusty hands. What is that smell?" Brother Thomas whispered, his earlier attempts at a smile long forgotten. "It's foul," Brother Simon stated unnecessarily, stepping back further. Brother Benedict knelt again, peering into the darkness of the newly breached cavity. The lamp he held cast a pool of light, but it didn't penetrate far into the void. It just seemed to highlight the edges of the opening and the thick blackness within. "It's cold inside," he murmured, "and damp." You knelt beside him, peering into the gap. It looked like a roughly rectangular space, perhaps 3 or 4 feet high and maybe 2 feet wide, extending back into the wall's depth. Its surface seemed rough-hewn, not smoothly plastered like a finished room, more like an unfinished space or a cavity left during construction. The air that seeped out carried that same awful smell, potent and undeniable now. "Can you see anything?" you asked, trying to control the tremor in your voice. Brother Benedict shook his head. "Only darkness. The lamp doesn't reach." This void, this hidden space, seemed to perfectly match the description of where the sounds had come from. Deep within the wall, seemingly inaccessible. It wasn't a large space, certainly not big enough for a person to stand in comfortably, maybe not even to sit up fully. But it was large enough. Large enough for something, an open scholarly debate phrase that crosses your mind in this tense moment. Historians still argue whether accounts of walled-in individuals in folklore and some historical narratives represent actual occurrences, exaggerated tales of punishment or containment, or symbolic representations of societal isolation or forgotten histories. Was this cavity a deliberate prison, a tomb, a forgotten storage space that had simply become stagnant? Or was it something even more bizarre, something that fed into the darker, less documented corners of human history and superstition? The awful smell certainly leaned towards the unpleasant possibilities. You needed more light. "Fetch another lamp," you instructed Brother Simon, who was more than happy to retreat from the immediate vicinity of the smell. While waiting, the monks stood back, rubbing their arms against the chill that seemed to emanate from the newly opened void. The sounds of their work were gone, replaced by a heavy silence, punctuated only by their breathing and the distant creaking of the old building. The initial relief of making a breakthrough was quickly overshadowed by the dread of what that breakthrough might reveal. Brother Simon returned with a second lamp, its light joining the first. Kneeling again, Brother Benedict and you positioned the lamps to shine into the cavity. The combined light pushed back the darkness a little further, revealing more of the internal space. It wasn't empty. The light glinted off rough stone surfaces within the cavity, but it also illuminated something else. Something dark and amorphous lying low in the space. It was hard to make out clearly in the limited light and the lingering dust, but it looked like shapes, not stone shapes, softer shapes, and the source of the smell seemed strongest from within this space. It was difficult to maintain the sleepy cadence now. The gentle sarcasm felt miles away. This was real, tangible, and deeply unnerving. You took a deep breath, trying to steel yourself against the smell and the growing sense of dread. "What is that? In there?" Brother Michael whispered, his voice trembling. Brother Benedict reached out tentatively with a crowbar, trying to poke at the dark shapes. The tool touched something soft, yielding slightly, and a puff of dust, and that foul air stirred from the cavity. The smell intensified for a moment, making you gag slightly. Whatever it wasn't stone. As the dust settled slightly and the light caught it just right, you could make out more detail. Lying in the bottom of the cavity, tangled and indistinct in the shadows, were what looked like rags, dark-stained, decaying cloth, and perhaps other things mixed in with them. Things you couldn't quite identify, but that contributed to the awful smell. It looked like some kind of material had been stuffed into the bottom of this space. Could the screams have come from a confined space filled with decaying matter? It seemed impossible. The screams had sounded human, desperate, full of terror and pain. Rags don't scream. Decaying matter doesn't scream. Unless the rags were associated with something else. Something that could scream. The implication hit you like a physical blow. Was this a tomb? Had someone been placed in here, alive or dead? The thought was sickening. Medieval punishments could be brutal, but sealing someone within a church wall seemed beyond even that. It felt like something out of a horror story, not historical reality. You looked at Brother Benedict, his face illuminated by the lamp, a mixture of horror and determination on his features. He seemed to understand the implication too. The possibility that this wasn't just an empty void, but a space containing something that had once been someone, was now chillingly real. The sun had long since set outside. The monastery was deep in the quietude of the night. But here in the choir, gathered around a gaping hole in the wall, silence had taken on a new, terrifying meaning. You had breached the barrier. You were now face to face with the ancient secret the wall had kept. And whatever was inside, dead or alive, silent now, or merely waiting, was the source of the screams. The dig wasn't over. Now came the part you had dreaded, discovering exactly what lay within that dark, foul-smelling cavity. The air was heavy with anticipation, the weight of centuries pressing down, and the undeniable, unsettling knowledge that you had found something terrible. The foul smell was your primary antagonist now, thick and clinging, making each breath an act of willpower. It seeped from the dark opening like a malevolent gas coating the air with the stench of decay and dampness. You knelt there with Brother Benedict, the combined light of the two lamps doing little more than defining the edges of the darkness within the cavity and highlighting the rough, uneven surface of the stone. Below the line of light, the dark shapes lay, indistinct, huddled together like some terrible nest. We need to see what that is," you said, your voice low, barely louder than a whisper. The monks behind you shifted uneasily. This was not contemplation, not prayer, not even the satisfying labor of building or repairing. This felt like trespassing on something ancient and profoundly disturbing. Brother Benedict hesitated for a moment, then nodded grimly. He picked up a small trowel, the kind used for fine mortar work, and extended it cautiously into the cavity. The air inside felt noticeably colder, contrasting sharply with the warmth radiating from the lamps and your own exertion. The trowel touched one of the shapes. It yielded with a soft give, and the terrible smell seemed to intensify. "It feels yielding," Brother Benedict murmured, pulling the trowel back. A tiny fleck of something dark and fibrous clung to the metal. It looked like decayed cloth. Okay, this was the moment. You had to see. Taking one of the lamps, you angled it downwards, trying to get a better view. The light illuminated a chaotic tangle of dark, damp material. It looked like layers upon layers of fabric, perhaps sacking or rough cloth mixed with something else, something lumpy and irregular. And the smell, it was beyond description. Earthy, putrid, overwhelmingly wrong. It made your eyes water and your gorge rise. You had smelled unpleasant things in your life, like forgotten gym socks left in a locker for a year, Or that time someone left milk out in the heat of summer? But this was on a completely different level. This was the smell of something that had been dead and confined for a very, very long time. Maybe a millennium, hard to say, but the sheer age of the decay was palpable. Can you gently pull some of that out? You asked Brother Benedict. The idea of reaching your hand into that cavity, into that smell and that darkness, was deeply repellent. Thank heavens for brave, if terrified, monks in small trowels. Brother Benedict carefully used the trowel to tease at the edge of the dark material. It seemed heavy and damp. As he pulled, a clump came free, dragging other pieces with it. He lifted it slowly out of the cavity and into the lamplight. It was indeed fabric, dark and stained, incredibly old and fragile, crumbling at the edges. It looked like pieces of a heavy, rough cloth, perhaps wool or linen, though it was impossible to tell for sure in its state of decay. Mixed in with the fabric were dark, clumpy bits of something. It looked like earth, but darker, richer, and mixed with organic matter. And the smell emanating directly from the clump was almost unbearable. A mainstream historical fact that might help contextualize this. In medieval times, sanitation and burial practices were vastly different from today. Waste disposal was rudimentary and diseases were rampant. While formal burials usually took place in consecrated ground, there are accounts of bodies or body parts being interred in unusual places, sometimes for symbolic reasons, sometimes out of necessity during plagues or conflicts. Furthermore, the practices surrounding death and decay were often intertwined with deeply held beliefs about the soul purgatory and the physical body's fate. The idea of finding something decaying and organic inside a building, while horrifying to modern sensibilities, might have had a complex context within the medieval mindset, though sealing something living inside would still be seen as monstrous. What is it? Brother Thomas asked, his voice thick with disgust and fear. He was holding a lamp, his hand trembling slightly, casting erratically dancing shadows on the wall. It looks like cloth, Brother Benedict said, dropping the small pile onto a dust sheet you had spread below the opening. It landed with a soft, damp thud. And soil. You peered closer. It wasn't just soil. It looked like earth heavily mixed with decayed organic matter. And something else. Something small and hard. You knelt carefully, using the tip of a penknife, a very anachronistic tool for this setting. But hey, you brought it to probe gently at the material. You nudged a small, hard white object embedded in the dark mass. It was smooth and curved. You nudged it again, carefully extracting it. It was a small bone. Not a large bone, perhaps a phalanx finger or toe bone, or a small carpal wrist bone. It was stained dark, but clearly bone. Silence descended again, heavier than the dust. Bone, mixed with decaying cloth and earth inside a cavity in the wall from which screams were heard. The implication was immediate, sickening, and undeniable. There's bone, Brother Simon stammered, looking pale even in the lamplight. Brother Benedict swallowed hard. He looked from the bone in your hand to the dark cavity, his face a mask of dawning horror. By the saints, he whispered. Okay, deep breaths. Stay calm. This was a historical investigation, however gruesome. It was interesting, in a profoundly messed up way. Like finding out your favorite historical figure secretly wore crocodile dung sunscreen and maybe walled people into his house. Remember that sunscreen, simpler times? You placed the small bone carefully on the dust sheet beside the pile of cloth. There were probably more in there. A lot more if this cavity contained a whole body. We need to be very careful. You said, your voice steadier now, despite the knot of dread tightening in your stomach. Whatever is in there, it might be very fragile, and we need to see exactly what's there, how it's positioned. This isn't just clearing rubble anymore. The goal had shifted from simply finding a void to carefully, painstakingly excavating a potential burial site inside a church wall from which someone had screamed. This was getting darker by the minute. You half expected a shadowy figure to appear in the corner, or the lamps to flicker out dramatically. The universe thankfully seemed content with just the smell for now. Brother Benedict nodded his initial shock, giving way to a grim determination. He was a monk dedicated to service and truth, and however horrific this discovery, it was a truth that needed uncovering. The other monks, though clearly shaken, seemed to rally around his resolve. They were faced with something unspeakable, but they were facing it together. Using smaller tools, trowels, brushes, even their hands wrapped in scraps of cloth, to avoid direct contact with the foul material, they began the delicate process of removing the contents of the cavity. It was slow, painstaking work. The material was damp and heavy, but also incredibly fragile, crumbling into dust at the slightest pressure. The smell was a constant assault. As they worked, more bones began to appear. Not just small ones, larger pieces, sections of ribs, vertebrae, fragments of larger long bones. They were tangled within the fabric, and earth seemingly crammed into the small space. It looked less like a careful burial and more like disposal or confinement. A quirky or fringe tidbit that flitted through your mind trying to make sense of the sheer strangeness of this. Some obscure alchemical or magical texts from later periods mention the use of human remains or objects associated with death being incorporated into structures, sometimes with the belief that it would empower the building, ward off evil, or even bind a spirit to the location. While this is far outside mainstream practice and likely more related to folklore or occult traditions, finding human remains sealed in a wall, particularly within a sacred building, certainly felt like it belonged to a darker, less understood corner of human history where superstition and pragmatic cruelty could intersect in terrifying ways. It's a body, Brother Thomas whispered, stating the obvious truth that had settled over them all like a shroud. It wasn't complete, at least not yet visible as a coherent skeleton. It was fragmented, tangled within the other material, and the position seemed unnatural, contorted, as if whatever was in there had been forced into the space. As more material was carefully removed, more of the form began to emerge. A curved line of ribs, the distinct shape of a skull fragment, dark and stained, nestled amongst the cloth. It was undeniable. There were human remains in the wall, and the smell was now identifiable not just as decay, but specifically as the decay of organic matter, perhaps combined with something else, something that contributed to its particular cloying unpleasantness. You tried another joke perhaps too soon, but the tension was immense. Well, at least we know where the term skeleton crew doesn't come from, you muttered, gesturing vaguely at the remains. Brother Benedict gave you a look that was a mixture of despair and "are you serious right now?" Yeah, maybe dial back the gallows humor. The light source was crucial now. The lamps cast shadows that made identification difficult. You needed something brighter, more focused. But in a medieval monastery, your options were limited. You made a mental note, another anachronism, to see if you could improvise something better for directional light, assuming you weren't all struck by divine lightning or dragged into the wall by whatever entity had been sealed within. An open scholarly debate phrase that felt particularly relevant in this horrifying moment. Historians still argue whether extreme forms of punishment or containment, including immurement, being walled up alive, were actual practices in medieval Europe, or primarily the stuff of legend, cautionary tales, and later sensationalized accounts. Finding a body possibly deliberately sealed within a wall directly confronted this debate. Was this cavity evidence of immurement, a barbaric punishment, or was it something else entirely? A hidden burial, a consequence of a violent act? The screams suggested the former, but the physical evidence was still ambiguous enough to fuel agonizing questions. The sheer effort required to get the material out of the narrow opening was significant. The monks had to work carefully, piece by piece, pulling the heavy, decaying mass forward. It was slow, physically demanding, and emotionally draining work, compounded by the constant nauseating smell. The dust sheet quickly accumulated a growing pile of dark, damp fabric, earth, and bone fragments. As they cleared the front part of the cavity, the space became slightly more visible. It seemed to extend further back into the wall than initially thought, maybe 6 feet deep. The width and height remained constant, a cramped coffin-like space running parallel to the choir wall. It wasn't a large space, definitely not comfortable, but large enough to contain a crouched or slumped body. More larger bones were recovered. Pieces of a pelvis, more long bone fragments that looked like parts of femurs or tibias. There were small broken pieces of what might have been ribs or other flat bones. The remains were not articulated. They were a jumbled mess within the confines of the cavity in the surrounding material. It looked like a body that had been tightly wrapped or bound before being placed inside, or one that had been subjected to extreme compression over centuries. And still the smell persisted, powerful and sickening. It wasn't just the smell of death, it was the smell of confinement, of stagnation of air that hadn't moved for centuries, mixing with profound decay. They worked in shifts now, the physical labor exhausting, the emotional toll immense. Brother Michael, despite his fear, worked diligently, his face pale but resolute. Brother Simon, though still jumpy, helped carefully gather the removed material. Brother Thomas, stoic and quiet, focused on the digging. Brother Benedict oversaw the process, his gaze fixed on the cavity, his brow furrowed in concentration and horror. You continued to observe, offering instructions where necessary, documenting in your mind every detail. The types of bones, their apparent disarticulation, the nature of the surrounding material, the specific dimensions of the cavity as they became clear. This was grim archaeology carried out in the worst possible conditions, illuminated by flickering lamps and accompanied by the pervasive stench of death. As the hours wore on deeper into the night, the amount of material removed grew substantial. It became clear that this was likely the remains of a single individual, likely an adult given the size of the larger bones recovered. The state of preservation was poor due to the damp environment within the wall. The bones were dark and brittle, the organic material around them a viscous, foul-smelling sludge in places. They reached a point where they had cleared much of the front and middle sections of the cavity. They could see deeper now. The back wall was visible, rough stone. The bottom of the cavity was filled with the densest concentration of the dark, foul-smelling organic matter and more bones. And then nestled deep within the cavity, partially obscured by the decaying fabric and soil, they saw it. Something else. Something that wasn't bone or cloth or earth. It was small, dark, and metallic. Brother Benedict saw it first. "There's something else in there," he said, his voice hushed again. Carefully, painstakingly, using the trowel and fingers wrapped in cloth, they worked to free the object. It was stuck fast in the thick, damp material. The anticipation was immense. What could it be? A possession buried with the body? Evidence of identity? Or something completely unexpected? After several minutes of careful work, teasing it free from the clinging decay, Brother Benedict managed to pull it out. He held it in his hand, bringing it into the light. It was a small, tarnished metal object, roughly circular with a loop at the top, suggesting it was meant to be worn or hung. It was dark with age and corrosion, but you could make out a faint shape on its surface, something carved or stamped into the metal. As you looked closer, wiping some of the grime away with a piece of cloth, the shape became clearer. It was a symbol, a religious symbol. Specifically, it looked like a cross, a simple, stylized cross, but unusual. It wasn't a standard Latin cross. It had slightly different proportions, perhaps a regional variation, or one specific to a particular order or belief. Or perhaps just a poorly made personal item. A small tarnished metal cross found with human remains, sealed in a wall from which screams were heard. The layers of mystery were deepening. Was this person a member of the clergy? A penitent? A prisoner? Why sealed here? Why the screams? The presence of the cross, while providing a potential clue, also added another layer of chilling paradox to the scene. To die or be left to die in such a horrific, confined manner, yet to be associated with a religious symbol, felt deeply disturbing within the context of a church. It suggested a history far more complex and perhaps more terrible than a simple accidental death, or even a conventional punishment. It felt like a violation, a desecration, regardless of the victim's identity. You looked from the cross in Brother Benedict's hand to the dark, still partially filled cavity, then to the pile of decaying matter and bones on the dust sheet. The physical evidence was stark and undeniable. Human remains were here. This was the source of the mystery. But uncovering what it meant, who this person was, and why they were here, that was a whole new terrifying puzzle that had just begun to reveal itself in the grim, flickering lamplight of the choir. The silence that followed the discovery of the cross was heavy, filled with unanswered questions and the persistent, awful smell. The small metal cross felt heavy and cold in Brother Benedict's hand, contrasting sharply with the persistent, cloying warmth of the decaying material it had been pulled from. The lamplight glinted weakly off its tarnished surface, revealing the simple, somewhat uneven shape. It was roughly an inch high, perhaps a little more, with a small loop at the top where a cord or chain would have gone. It wasn't ornate. No jewels, no elaborate carvings, just the basic form of the cross, stamped or perhaps crudely carved into the metal. You leaned closer, careful not to touch it with your bare hands. Who knew what kind of lovely medieval germs were lingering? "Let's look at it carefully," you murmured. The others gathered around, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and lingering dread. The smell, momentarily forgotten in the shock of discovery, reasserted itself, a constant, unwelcome companion. It was the smell of death, yes, but also the smell of damp earth, ancient stone, and something else you couldn't quite place, something musky and deeply unpleasant. Brother Benedict held the cross steady. You used the penknife handle end this time to gently scrape away some of the caked-on grime. As the layers of earth and decay fell away, the metal beneath appeared slightly lighter, but still dark with centuries of corrosion. The shape of the cross was clearer now, simple vertical and horizontal bars intersecting. It wasn't perfectly symmetrical, suggesting it was handmade rather than mass-produced, if such a thing even existed in this context. It wasn't a grand pectoral cross worn by a high-ranking cleric, nor did it seem like an expensive piece of jewelry. It looked like a personal item, perhaps, devotional, perhaps an identifier. A cross, Brother Thomas said, stating the obvious. Could they have been a priest or a monk? It was a logical assumption, finding a religious symbol in a church wall next to a body, but the simplicity of it argued against a high ecclesiastical rank. Many lay people wore or carried crosses for protection or as symbols of faith. This cross could belong to anyone devout, or perhaps its very simplicity was significant. A member of a strict, impoverished order, lay brother. Or maybe it was simply the only thing the person had on them when they were placed here. You look back at the cavity, still dark and forbidding, despite the partial clearing. More bones were visible now, lying haphazardly amidst the remaining decay. A curved rib section, a long bone fragment, part of a jawbone, with a few still attached teeth, dark and stained. The state of the remains suggested not a peaceful burial, but a violent or hurried end, or perhaps simply the ravages of time and confinement in a damp space. "We need to be systematic," you said, trying to inject a note of detached professionalism into the grim situation. "We've got remains, cloth earth, and this cross. Are there any other objects in the cavity?" Brother Benedict, his initial shock replaced by focused determination, began to probe gently again using the trowel. The material was thickest at the back and bottom of the cavity. It was slow work scraping and pulling the heavy, foul-smelling sludge and fabric towards the opening. More bone fragments emerged, sections of skull pieces of vertebrae, smaller hand and foot bones. It was confirming what was already suspected: a body was here. And the way the bones were scattered and tangled with the fabric suggested it hadn't been a natural death followed by a respectful burial in a proper grave. A mainstream historical fact that provides context for this. In medieval times, identification of individuals, particularly commoners, or those outside noble or clerical ranks, was far more difficult than today. Possessions, distinctive clothing, or perhaps specific injuries noted during life might offer clues, but without written records or detailed physical descriptions, identifying skeletal remains centuries later was a significant challenge. Forensic science as we know it didn't exist. Often identity in death was tied to social status, place of burial, consecrated ground for the faithful, unconsecrated for criminals, suicides or unbaptized infants, and any accompanying artifacts or inscriptions, which were rare for the poor. As they continued to clear the cavity, more of the dark, decaying fabric came out. It was layered, suggesting the person might have been wrapped in multiple layers of coarse cloth, perhaps a shroud, or even just bundled up in whatever they were wearing. The fabric was incredibly degraded, crumbling to dust at a touch, but its texture seemed rough like sackcloth or coarse wool. Not fine linen or silk. This pointed away from nobility or high status. "There's something else," Brother Thomas said, his voice strained from the smell and the tension. He was carefully brushing away material near the back of the cavity opening. He pulled out a small clump of the dark earth and fabric. As he separated it, something small and hard clinked onto the dust sheet. It was another object. You knelt to examine it. It was smaller than the cross, also made of metal, but a different shape. Circular, flat, with a small hole pierced near the edge. It looked like A coin. A very old, very tarnished coin. Finding a coin with the body was another significant clue. Coins could indicate wealth or lack thereof, and their date could potentially provide a terminus post quem, a date after which, meaning the person couldn't have been sealed in before that coin was minted. This was like a tiny, horribly grim time capsule. You carefully picked up the coin again, trying to handle it minimally. It was dark, almost black with age and corrosion. You rubbed at it gently with a cloth. It was hard to make out any details. Medieval coins, especially smaller denominations, were often crudely struck. You could faintly see a raised circle around the edge, and perhaps a central design, but it was too obscured. A coin? Brother Benedict breathed his eyes wide. Can you tell what kind? You shook your head. Not like this. It's too corroded. We'd need to clean it, maybe examine it under magnification. But it's definitely a coin, a medieval one judging by how it looks. Aru, this was like finding a penny in a pharaoh's tomb. Completely out of place for your usual historical adventures, but fascinating in its own dreadful way. And slightly infuriating that the universe wouldn't just give you a nicely preserved date stamp. Maybe the person could have left a note, walled up here on October 26, 1347. Send help. Also, maybe a sandwich. One could only wish for such clarity. A quirky or fringe tidbit that this discovery brought to mind. In some historical periods and cultures, coins were deliberately placed with the dead as payment for passage to the afterlife, like Charon's obol in Greek myth, or as symbolic offerings. While this practice was less common in medieval Christian Europe than in pagan times, finding a single worn coin could potentially reflect a vestige of older customs, a personal belief, or simply be a coin that happened to be in the person's pocket. Alternatively, some folklore suggests burying specific objects, including coins or personal items, near structures to ward off evil or appease restless spirits. A dark thought considering the screams. So now you had a body-decaying fabric, a simple cross, and a tarnished coin. What did this tell you? The simplicity of the artifacts suggested someone of modest means. The cross indicated some connection to faith or religious life, or at least identification with it. The coin might give a rough time frame if it could be identified. The state of the body and its location pointed strongly away from a natural, respected death and burial. The monks worked tirelessly, though their movements were slower now, more deliberate, fueled by a mixture of grim determination and the pressing need to understand what they had found. The smell was still overpowering, but perhaps your senses were starting to grow numb to it, a small mercy in the face of such horror. They continued to remove the remaining material from the cavity, carefully placing everything onto the dust sheet. More bones were uncovered. It looked like a relatively complete skeleton was present, albeit disarticulated and fragmented. Ribs, vertebrae, long bones, skull fragments, pieces of hands and feet. Everything seemed to be there, just jumbled together with the fabric and earth. It was packed into the narrow space, suggesting the body had been folded, pushed, or compressed into the cavity. As they cleared the final layers, the full extent of the cavity became visible. It was, as suspected, a narrow space running horizontally into the wall, perhaps 6 feet deep, maybe 3 feet high, and 2 feet wide. Just large enough to cram an adult body into. The walls and floor of the cavity were rough stone, showing no signs of deliberate carving or preparation, just the natural unevenness of the masonry and infill. This wasn't a purpose-built crypt. It was a void that had been sealed. And at the very back, pressed against the stone, they found one more thing. It wasn't large. It was a small, smooth piece of wood. It looked almost like a splinter from a plank, but it was slightly curved and worked. As Brother Benedict held it up, you saw small, faint lines carved into its surface. "What is it?" Brother Michael asked, peering at the tiny piece of wood. You took it gently. It was indeed wood, smooth on one side, rough on the other. The carved lines were faint, almost worn away by time and decay. You angled it in the lamplight, trying to decipher them. They weren't letters, not obvious script. They were more like symbols. Simple lines, perhaps scratches. Were they random, or did they mean something? It was tantalizingly unclear. Could it be some kind of tally mark, a prayer, a message? A desperate carving made by the person while they were alive. The thought sent a chill down your spine, that had nothing to do with the damp air. An open scholarly debate phrase that instantly sprang to mind. Historians still argue about the literacy rates and forms of communication among different social classes in the medieval period, particularly regarding non-clerical or non-noble individuals. Simple symbols, tally marks, or non-standard scripts might represent attempts at communication or record-keeping by those with limited formal education, but interpreting them centuries later without context is notoriously difficult. This little piece of wood felt like a direct challenge to that debate. Was this the last desperate communication of someone sealed in a wall? You carefully placed the piece of wood next to the cross and the coin on the dust sheet. These three objects, the cross, the coin, the carved wood, were the only potential clues beyond the body itself. Everything else was bone fabric and earth. The excavation of the cavity was complete. The narrow space was now empty, dark, and echoing slightly, though the smell lingered potent and unchanging. On the dust sheet lay the grim results, a pile of decaying material, fragmented bones, a simple cross, a tarnished coin, and a tiny piece of carved wood. Looking at the collection, you tried to piece together a narrative. Someone was put into that cavity. They were likely wrapped in cloth. They had a personal cross, a coin, and this strange piece of carved wood. The screams heard centuries later suggested they were alive when they were sealed in. The position and state of the bones suggested they were forced in. Who were they? Why were they here? And what did that little piece of wood mean? This wasn't just a discovery. It was a profound mystery embedded in the very fabric of the church. The silence in the choir was heavy now, not just with the smell, but with the weight of history and human suffering. The monks looked exhausted, their faces pale under the lamps. They had expected perhaps old relics, a hidden chamber, maybe even treasure. Not this. Never this. So, Brother Benedict said, finally his voice tired, "What do we do now?" Good question. You had found the source of the screams. You had found the person sealed within the wall. But understanding why they were there, understanding the full horror of their final moments was far from complete. You needed to examine the evidence more closely. Try to identify the coin. Try to interpret the symbols on the wood. Try to learn anything you could from the bones themselves, though that would be difficult without expert knowledge you didn't possess in this medieval setting. This was no longer a simple investigation. It was a full-blown archaeological and historical puzzle, albeit one tinged with profound tragedy and unsettling implications. You had peeled back a layer of the church's history, and what lay beneath was darker and more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. You couldn't unsee it. You couldn't unsmell it. The monastery's peaceful facade had been irrevocably cracked, revealing the potential for unimaginable cruelty hidden within its very walls. And you were the one who had led them to uncover it. Just another Tuesday, right? Finding a skeleton in a wall. Happens all the time. No just you figures. The next step was clear, even if daunting. You had to study the evidence you had found, and you had to try to understand the screams. Were they a one-time event, the final cries of the immured person? Or had the space somehow held an echo of their torment across the centuries? The rational part of your brain rebelled against the latter, but the sheer undeniable fact of the screams, coupled with this horrific discovery, made dismissing it impossible. Something profound and terrible had happened here, and you were only just beginning to grasp its full horror. The lamps cast long, flickering shadows in the choir, making the empty cavity look even deeper, more menacing. The pile of decay on the sheet was a stark visual representation of a life, or rather a death that had been hidden and forgotten for centuries. Until now. Until the screams had finally been heard and answered. The dust sheet on the cold stone floor had become a macabre display table. You knelt beside it, the scent of decay still thick and clinging, a constant, unwelcome guest in your nostrils. Around you, the monks hovered, their earlier fear and excitement now replaced by a somber, almost stunned silence. The flickering lamps cast dancing shadows, making the pile of bones and materials seem to writhe faintly. This wasn't just history on a page. It was raw, visceral, and intensely unsettling. Time to put on your best detective hat. Hopefully a metaphorical one that smells better than the current reality. Okay, you said, your voice a low murmur in the vast space of the choir. Let's look at what we've got. Carefully. You started with the small metal cross. You picked it up gingerly, feeling the cool, rough metal against your fingertips. It wasn't much cleaner than when it first emerged, still dark and corroded. You tried scraping at it again with the tip of a penknife. You really needed a forensic kit. But alas, this was medieval Europe, not a CSI convention. A little more grime flaked off, revealing a slightly duller coppery sheen beneath the dark surface. Looks like copper alloy, you mused aloud. Maybe bronze or just plain copper. Copper alloys were common for cheaper metalwork in the medieval period. This reinforced the idea of someone of modest means. A wealthier person might have a silver or gold cross, perhaps one set with small stones. This was functional, devotional, personal, but definitely not fancy. It spoke of piety, certainly, but not of high social standing or significant wealth within the church hierarchy itself. It felt worn, too, as if it had been handled frequently, perhaps clutched during prayer, or worn constantly around the neck. You placed the cross down and turned to the coin. This was potentially the most useful artifact for dating, but also the most frustratingly obscure in its current state. It was small, round, and utterly black, with centuries of grime and oxidation. You tried rubbing it on the dust sheet, but that did nothing. You needed something to clean it gently. Water wouldn't work well on this kind of corrosion without potentially damaging it, and you certainly didn't have any specialized cleaning agents handy. Brother Benedict, ever practical, rummaged in a pouch attached to his belt. Perhaps a little lamp oil, he suggested, hesitantly holding out a small vial. You winced. Probably not the best idea. We don't want to damage it further. Oil can seep into micro fissures and make it harder to conserve later. And it might just make it sticky and gross. As if it wasn't already, you needed a professional conservator, or at least someone with a delicate brush and magnification. Given the resources, a few monks, some lamps, a trowel, and a penknife, your options were limited. All right, you sighed. Let's try just looking really hard. You held the coin closer to a lamp. The faint raised edge was visible. You rotated it. Was that a rough shape in the center? Could it be a king's profile, or maybe a symbol like a cross or a shield? Medieval coinage varied wildly depending on the region and the ruler. Identifying this would require expertise you didn't possess in this context, not without being able to consult references or specialists. It was like trying to identify a modern penny that had been buried for 800 years and looked like a tiny black rock. Annoyingly, medieval people didn't seem to understand the importance of putting clear, legible dates on their money for future amateur historians. Seriously, a simple Anno Domini 13XX would have been so helpful right now. What were they thinking? You handed the coin carefully to Brother Thomas, who had slightly steadier hands. He held it under the light, turning it this way and that. "It is very dark," he murmured. "Can you discern anything at all?" You shook your head. "Not clearly. It's too corroded. We need to clean it properly. But the size, it's small. Perhaps a penny or a halfpenny that would also fit with someone of lower status. Or maybe it's just a regional variation. Or maybe it's not a coin at all. What if it's a token or a weight?" The possibilities were frustratingly endless without better information. This brought up a mainstream historical fact. Medieval coinage systems were complex and varied across Europe. Different kingdoms, principalities, and even powerful cities minted their own coins. The value and purity of these coins fluctuated, and counterfeiting was rampant. Common denominations like the penny, often made of silver or base metal, were the most widely circulated, used for daily transactions, while larger coins like groats or gold florins were for more significant purchases. Identifying a specific coin, especially a worn or corroded one, requires detailed knowledge of the metal content, weight, diameter, and the specific iconography used by different rulers and mints during various periods. Without specialized knowledge, this small disc remains stubbornly silent about its origins. Next, you turned to the small piece of carved wood. You picked it up. It was light dry now, and surprisingly smooth on one side, rough on the other. You held it under the lamp. The faint lines were still there. You traced them with a fingertip, feeling the slight indentations. They weren't deep cuts, more like scratches or shallow carvings. "Look at these," you said, showing it to the monks. They leaned in, peering intently. The symbols were hard to describe. One looked a bit like an X. Another was just a single vertical line. Then there was a curved line, almost like a hook. Were they letters? Not like any Latin script you recognized, or vernacular script from the period, though. Regional variations existed. Could they be numbers, tally marks? If so, what were they counting? Days, prayers, beatings? The thought was grim. Or were they symbols, maybe religious symbols, early Christian or folk symbols, protective marks? It was infuriatingly ambiguous. This was where the real mystery lay, perhaps. The cross suggested faith, the coin suggested status and a potential time frame, but the wood felt deeply personal, maybe even a message. You angled the wood again, trying to catch the light differently. The lines seemed deliberately made, not random scratches. They had a pattern, however simple. Could this be the victim's attempt to leave a record, to communicate their identity or their plight? Or perhaps it was something entirely different, a personal talisman, a devotional aid, or even a crude form of game piece, a quirky or fringe tidbit that added another layer of complexity. Throughout history, people have used various non-standard methods for record keeping or communication, especially those who were illiterate or semi-literate. These included notched sticks, tally sticks, knots like Andean quipus, or simple symbols understood within a specific community or context. Sometimes these symbols were linked to folk magic devotional practices, outside formal church liturgy, or even early forms of cryptography. This piece of wood could fall into any of those categories, making interpretation incredibly speculative. It's not obvious, you admitted. Could be tally marks, could be devotional symbols, could be something else entirely. Without knowing who this person was or the context, it's very hard to say. It was like finding a single emoji carved into a cave wall and trying to figure out the entire plot of a movie. Was it big difference? Finally, you turned your attention to the bones. They lay in a jumbled pile on the sheet, fragments mixed with larger pieces. Ribs, vertebrae, skull pieces, long bones from arms and legs, smaller bones from hands and feet. You carefully picked up a piece of a long bone. It was brittle, stained dark with earth and decay. Examining skeletal remains for identification is a specialized skill relying on knowledge of anatomy, pathology, and taphonomy, how things decay and fossilize. You weren't an osteoarchaeologist, but you could make some basic observations. The size of the bones seemed to suggest an adult. Estimating age from skeletal remains is tricky, especially without a full skeleton and specific markers. But there weren't obvious signs of extreme old age, like significant degenerative changes or extreme youth. Somewhere in adulthood, perhaps, you looked for signs of trauma, broken bones, cut marks, anything that might indicate how the person died. Most of the bones seemed intact, though many were fragmented from decay or perhaps being forced into the space. You picked up a piece of skull. There was a large section missing, but the remaining pieces didn't show obvious signs of, say, a massive blow. Before death, though, post-mortem damage couldn't be ruled out given the conditions. The jawbone looked relatively intact. There were still teeth, dark and stained, but visible. Examining teeth can sometimes give clues about diet and age, but again, this required expertise you didn't possess. You also tried to guess gender. This is difficult from a partial skeleton, but sometimes possible from features of the pelvis or skull. You carefully examined a few fragments that might be from the pelvic region, but they were small and decayed. Skull morphology can also offer clues, but the skull was broken into pieces. Based purely on the apparent gracility or lack thereof of the bones you could see, it was hard to say definitively. Maybe slightly smaller than an average male build, but well within the range of either sex or a smaller man or a larger woman. It was frustratingly ambiguous. The identity of the victim remained elusive. Were they male or female, young or old? Who were they? The condition of the bones was telling, though. They were fragmented and scattered amongst the cloth, packed into the narrow space. This wasn't a carefully laid out body in a grave. This person had been forced into the cavity, likely while wrapped or clothed. The lack of visible, obvious major trauma on the bones didn't necessarily mean they weren't injured, of course. Soft tissue injuries leave no mark on bone, and someone could have been suffocated, strangled, or died from internal injuries or even exposure after being sealed in. An open scholarly debate phrase came to mind as you looked at the fragmented remains. Historians still debate the frequency and nature of violent crime and extrajudicial punishment in the medieval period, particularly within institutions like monasteries or private estates where authority structures could be complex and accountability sometimes limited. 80. Was this the result of a crime? A punishment, something else entirely? The location sealed within the church wall felt deliberate, hidden. You knelt there surrounded by the evidence of a centuries-old horror, and the enormity of the situation settled on you. You had found the person whose final moments had echoed across time, but you knew almost nothing about them. Their name, their story, the reason for their terrible fate, it was all locked away. The cross suggested they were likely Christian, the coins suggested modest means. The wood suggested something personal and unknown, and the bones suggested an adult forced violently into a hidden space. It painted a picture, but it was frustratingly incomplete. You looked at the monks, Brother Benedict, Brother Thomas, Brother Michael, and the others who had gathered, their faces etched with fatigue, confusion, and a lingering deep unease. They had lived with the screams, tried to ignore them, tried to rationalize them. Now the screams had a physical, horrifying answer, and it was far worse than any ghost story. So, you said, your voice quiet, we have someone, likely an adult of modest means based on the few possessions, forced into this cavity and sealed in. The state of the bones suggests they weren't carefully buried, but perhaps put in here roughly. But who? Brother Thomas whispered. Why were they a monk? A layperson. The cross could mean they were religious, but it could also just be a personal item of faith. You replied. Lots of people wore crosses. The simple coin and the coarse fabric fragments. It doesn't scream wealthy patron or high-ranking abbot. More like an ordinary person, or perhaps someone who had renounced wealth. Could it have been a punishment? Brother Michael asked, his eyes wide. For a great sin? You nodded slowly. Imprisonment, even immurement, being walled up, was a horrific form of punishment, known throughout history, though perhaps more common in literature and legend than widespread practice within monasteries themselves. But the screams suggested they were alive when it happened. That was the most chilling part. It's possible, you admitted. Or maybe it was to hide something. A death that wasn't supposed to happen. A body that wasn't supposed to be found. The silence that followed this suggestion was heavy. Hiding a body within the very walls of a holy place? The sacrilege alone was profound. You looked at the small pile of evidence again. The cross, the coin, the strange carved wood. These were the only voices this person had left behind besides the echoes of their final cries. And those voices were speaking in riddles. You needed to try and make sense of them. Clean the coin, see if any detail could be discerned. Study the carvings on the wood again, looking for patterns, anything that might resonate with known symbols or scripts. This was no longer just a historical investigation. It felt deeply personal. You had uncovered a human tragedy centuries old, and it demanded answers. The quiet peace of the monastery was now permanently overlaid with the knowledge of the suffering its stones held. And you were the one holding the key, a handful of bones, a simple cross, a tarnished coin, and a piece of carved wood. Just another Tuesday evening uncovering medieval true crime. Better than watching reality TV, right? Though arguably less relaxing. You gathered the items, carefully placing them in a clean cloth Brother Benedict provided. We need to take these somewhere safe, you said. And then we need to think. Really think about what this means. The monks agreed, their faces pale and drawn. They had faced down their ghosts and found something far more terrifyingly human. The screams had led them not to a spiritual mystery, but to a physical, brutal act of violence hidden within their sacred walls. The weight of centuries felt heavier than ever in the silent choir. The smell, the lingering scent of decay and death, was a constant reminder of the dark secret the church had held for so long. And the questions remained hanging in the air like dust motes in the lamplight. Who? Why? And could there be other secrets hidden in the ancient stone? The subtle sounds that had been just on the edge of hearing, easily dismissed, start to assert themselves with undeniable clarity. No longer are they vague suggestions of movement or settling. They gain definition, presence, becoming harder than impossible to ignore. That faint scritch from the scriptorium wall. It's now a definite rhythmic scrape, 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 sounding less like claws and more like something being dragged slowly against rough stone. The almost whisper during prayer, it deepens into a low groan that seems to vibrate through the very stones you kneel upon. The thin high note at night, it takes on a quality that sends a chill down your spine, a faint muffled whimper that sounds eerily like distress. You try the old rationalizations, of course. Maybe the building really is just settling in a dramatic new way. Maybe the mice have formed a tiny disciplined army and are engaging in coordinated large-scale construction projects deep within the walls. You almost smile at the absurdity, but the sound cuts the humor short. Maybe it's just a particularly persistent draft, creating new unsettling acoustic effects. But these explanations feel flimsy now, inadequate to the increasing insistence of the noise. The sounds are no longer confined to specific moments or locations. They seem to follow you, or rather they are present in multiple areas of the monastery you frequent. The scriptorium, the choir, the cloister walk, even near the entrance to the chapter house. And they are happening more often. Not constantly, but with a frequency that disrupts the expected periods of deep silence. You'll be walking down the cloister garth, the sun warm on your face, the scent of herbs from the garden in the air, and there it is, a soft dragging sound from the wall beside you, like a sack of heavy stones being pulled along. You stop, listen. It ceases. You take a step. It resumes. You freeze again. Silence. It's infuriatingly elusive when you actively seek it out, but undeniably present in the background of your activities. Your concentration suffers terribly. During copying, your quill falters, leaving blots on the precious parchment. During prayer, your mind drifts, straining to pick out the specific quality of a new sound. You find yourself pausing mid-shore, head tilted, listening intently, earning a few curious glances from brothers who notice your sudden stillness. Sleep, which was already a fragmented affair dictated by the night offices, becomes even more elusive. Lying in the dormitory in the cold, heavy dark, you listen to the breathing of your brothers and the expected creaks of the old timbers. But now beneath it all, there's that intermittent, muffled thump, or a sound like something heavy being gently nudged within the stone. You pull your thin blanket tighter, wishing for the dawn. The psychological toll begins to mount. The unease grows into a persistent anxiety. You start to feel like you're being watched, or that the building itself is somehow alive and unhappy. The comforting solidity of the stone walls, which once felt like a secure embrace from the world, now seems menacing, harboring something unseen and unsettling. You try talking about it hesitantly at first. You might lean over to a brother you trust during a moment of permitted conversation, perhaps during a meal, keeping your voice low, and say, "Brother, have you noticed anything unusual about the walls lately?" Sound. The response is usually a puzzled frown. A sound like what? The wind. You try to describe it, but the words feel inadequate. No, not the wind. More like a scraping or a sighing almost. He might shake his head, looking at you strangely. Perhaps you are tired, brother. The silence can play tricks on the mind. This dismissal is disheartening, making you wonder if you are losing your grip, if the extreme asceticism or the relentless schedule is finally getting to you. But then maybe you see a flicker of recognition in someone's eyes. An older monk, perhaps, who has been here for decades. You mention the scraping, and he nods slowly, a faint troubled look on his face. "Ah, yes," he might murmur. "The old building has its noises, always has." But the way he says it, the slight hesitation suggests he knows it's more than just old building noises. Or you might overhear hushed whispers between two brothers, their faces serious, glancing towards a particular wall. The sounds are starting to penetrate the collective consciousness, albeit still in a tentative, whispered way. You are not alone in hearing them. Mainstream historical fact, medieval church and monastery walls were incredibly thick, often several feet deep, constructed from quarried stone and rubble held together with mortar. This mass was designed for structural integrity, insulation against weather, and sometimes defensive purposes. Creating chambers or hidden spaces within such walls during construction wasn't impossible, though typically these would be deliberate architectural features like stairwells, small chapels, or storage niches, not random voids. The sheer density and thickness would also serve to significantly muffle any sound originating from deep inside. Here's a quirky historical tidbit. Some medieval monasteries had specific rules about how loudly monks were allowed to cough or sneeze during services, emphasizing the desire for profound quiet and reverence. Imagine trying to suppress a sneeze during a particularly loud groan from the wall beside you. It highlights how attuned the monks were to the minutiae of sound, or lack thereof, in their environment, making these disruptive noises all the more jarring against the expected backdrop. The sounds gain a disturbing complexity. It's not just scraping now. There are dull thuds as if something heavy is being dropped or dragged across stone floors within the wall. There are what sound like muffled impacts, like something is hitting the inside of the stone. And the whimpering sound, it seems to fluctuate, sometimes soft, sometimes rising slightly in intensity before fading again. It's deeply unsettling because it sounds vaguely, horribly human. Historians still argue whether the reports of strange phenomena in medieval monasteries, ranging from odd noises to apparent visions or visitations, were purely psychological manifestations of stress, asceticism, and communal suggestion, or if they sometimes had an external, albeit misunderstood cause. Were these monks truly hearing something inexplicable, or were their minds stretched thin by routine and spiritual striving, creating these auditory illusions? You find yourself drawn to the walls despite the dread they now inspire. You press your ear against the cold stone where the scraping seems loudest. You hear nothing, or perhaps a very faint vibration, but no distinct sound. You tap the stone again, harder this time. It's solid, unyielding. Where are the sounds coming from? How can they be so clear one moment and completely absent the next, especially when you are actively trying to hear them? It feels like the sounds are mocking you, playing a cruel game of hide and seek within the ancient stone. You start to develop theories ranging from the mundane to the terrifying. Could someone be hiding in the walls? A fugitive seeking sanctuary somehow, navigating a hidden network of passages? Unlikely given the apparent thickness and lack of obvious entrances. Could it be some strange animal trapped inside? A large bird, a badger, something capable of making those kinds of scraping and thudding noises? Possible, but the whimpering, that doesn't sound like any animal you know. Could it be something else, something unnatural? Your disciplined mind shies away from this, but the persistent, unsettling nature of the sounds makes it increasingly difficult to dismiss the possibility of something truly disturbing at play. The monastery, your sanctuary, is beginning to feel less like a haven and more like a prison, albeit one made of ancient groaning stone that seems to whisper secrets you desperately do not want to hear. The rhythm of prayer and work continues, but the underlying tension is palpable, at least to you. You see it now in the quick, uneasy glances of a few other brothers, the way they might abruptly stop talking if you approach the way they too seem to listen, perhaps subconsciously during the periods of silence. You're all in this together, whether everyone admits it yet or not. The walls are talking, and their conversation is becoming terrifyingly clear. It's like a bad house guest who started with polite coughs and is now full-on slamming doors and humming off-key show tunes at 3 a.m. Not exactly conducive to contemplative silence. You try praying specifically about the sounds. You ask for guidance for peace for the sounds to cease. You petition Saint Michael the Archangel Defender against evil. You perform extra penances wondering if these sounds are some form of divine displeasure or a test of faith. But the sounds continue, oblivious to your spiritual efforts, a persistent grating counterpoint to your prayers. The scraping seems to intensify near the refectory wall during meals. The thuds are sometimes loudest near the chapter house. The whimpering often seems to emanate from the walls surrounding the choir stalls during services. It's almost as if the sounds are tied to the communal spaces, to the heart of monastic life, deliberately disrupting its peace and order. This geographical aspect, however inconsistent, adds another layer of confusion and dread. It's not just a wall, it's these walls everywhere you turn within the central complex. The initial subtlety is gone. The sounds are still muffled by the thick stone, but they are distinct, varied, and persistent. They are no longer background noise, they are foreground anxiety. They are a challenge to your sanity, to your faith, and to the very nature of the peaceful, ordered life you have chosen within these ancient walls. The quiet is broken not by external noise, but by something trapped and struggling within the stones themselves. And you, along with a few others, are beginning to realize that this isn't just the building settling. It's something much, much worse. You brace yourself because if the sounds are escalating like this, the next stage is likely to be unavoidable. The sounds which had been playing their infuriating game of hide and seek now shed any pretense of subtlety. They don't disappear when you stop and listen anymore. They persist, a relentless, terrible symphony emanating from deep within the monastery's stone guts. It's no longer just the sporadic scrape, 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 or the muffled thump. These noises coalesce, gaining rhythm and intensity. The scraping turns frantic, a desperate clawing sound that suggests something is trying with all its might to dig its way out. The thuds become heavier, more deliberate, like a frustrated beating against an unyielding surface. And the whimpering. Oh, the whimpering. It escalates into choked sobs, ragged gasps, and eventually unmistakable muffled screams. Not the wind, not settling stone, not even a badger caught in a void. These are sounds of pure, unadulterated terror and agony echoing from within the very walls that are meant to shelter you. They are undeniably horribly human. You are not the only one who hears them now. The hesitant glances have turned into open looks of fear among the brothers. The whispered conversations are gone, replaced by a stunned communal silence, punctuated only by the terrible sounds themselves. During sex, while trying to focus on the psalms, a piercing, muffled shriek erupts from the wall behind the altar. The choir falters, voices dying out one by one, as every monk freezes eyes wide, listening to the sound of suffering trapped in stone. It's like a jump scare, but instead of being startled by something appearing, you're terrified by something you can't see, something hidden away in the unlikeliest of places. The abbot, initially inclined to dismiss it as fatigue or fancy, can no longer ignore the collective distress of his community and the undeniable disturbing nature of the sounds. He calls a meeting in the chapter house, the air thick with dread. Brothers shuffle in their faces, pale, their habitual composure shattered. The sounds even here seem to permeate the space, a low thrumming beneath the heavy silence occasionally punctuated by a faint groan or a desperate scuffle. It's like being in a room with a terrible secret, and the secret is starting to shout. You sit among the others, feeling the cold seep from the stone bench into your bones. And it's not just the temperature, it's the dread of the stone itself. The abbot speaks, his voice unusually strained. Brothers, he begins, we are faced with something none of us understands. These sounds, they are not natural. They are not of the building settling. They are disturbing. He looks around the room, his gaze meeting yours for a moment, acknowledging the shared burden of what you're hearing. Many of you have come to me or spoken amongst yourselves. You hear them too. We all hear them now. This collective confirmation is both validating and terrifying. You weren't going mad. But if you weren't going mad, what was happening? Someone speaks up, his voice trembling. Abbot, it sounds like someone is trapped inside the walls. A ripple of assent passes through the room. The awful truth, which you had all perhaps subconsciously avoided articulating, is finally spoken aloud. Something or someone is sealed within the monastery's ancient stone structure, and they are in terrible distress. The sounds are no longer random. They seem to intensify when you approach certain sections of wall, particularly in areas that seem architecturally significant, perhaps near the foundational stones of the church, or along the length of the main cloister walk, or beneath the chapter house itself. It's almost as if the trap source is moving, or perhaps their cries are simply loudest at certain points relative to their unseen location. You might find yourself standing by the pillar in the cloister garth, admiring the simple beauty of the garden, when a sudden muffled scream tears through the air right beside you, making you jump back as if scalded. The thought that someone is trapped evokes a new kind of horror, different from the abstract fear of the unknown noises. This is a concrete, terrible possibility. Who could it be? How did they get there? And most agonizingly, how can you get them out? The incredibly thick, solid stone walls, which once felt like a source of comfort and security, now feel like an insurmountable prison wall, trapping not just a victim, but trapping the sound of their suffering within its unyielding mass. Mainstream historical fact: medieval building techniques for large stone structures, like monasteries, involved laying massive stones, sometimes weighing many tons, using mortar as a binding agent. The walls were often built with two outer layers of dressed stone and a core filled with rubble and smaller stones, all packed together with mortar. Creating a void within such a dense structure, large enough to contain a person and sealed off entirely, would have been an incredibly difficult and unusual feat, requiring deliberate planning either during initial construction or a later highly invasive modification. This fact underscores how improbable the situation you're facing is, making the reality of the sounds even more baffling and frightening. The sheer impossibility of the situation adds to the psychological pressure. How can a person be inside the wall? Were they put there when why is this some ancient, terrible secret of the monastery? Or is it something new, something recent and horrifying? The monastic schedule, the comforting repetition of prayer and labor, becomes a thin veneer over a foundation of fear. Every moment of silence is now filled with anticipation, waiting for the next muffled cry, the next desperate scraping. Here's a quirky historical tidbit. Monasteries often had extensive cellars and tunnels, sometimes used for storage, sometimes for escape routes during times of conflict, and sometimes allegedly for more nefarious purposes. While usually beneath the building, the idea of hidden passages and spaces wasn't entirely alien to medieval monastic complexes. Could what you're hearing be from a forgotten, sealed-off section of these underground networks, somehow acoustically connected to the walls above? It's a desperate thought, but one that offers a slightly less terrifying alternative to someone being literally entombed within the solid stone structure. The abbot organizes a search, but it feels hopeless from the start. Where do you even look? The sounds seem to come from everywhere and nowhere specific when you try to pinpoint them directly. You hammer on the walls, listening for a hollow spot, but the stone is uniformly dense and solid. You check every known passage, every cellar, every rarely used storage room. Nothing. The monastery is vast, ancient, and full of nooks and crannies, but none that seem to explain the source of the increasingly desperate sounds. It's like searching for a phantom limb. You know it's there, causing agony, but you can't touch. It can't find its location. The screams become more prolonged, punctuated by periods of agonizing silence. They shift in quality, sometimes sharp and sudden, like a cry of pain, other times long and drawn out like a lament. You can almost hear the texture of the voice, the desperation in the timbre, even muffled by feet of stone. It's no longer just noise, it's a communication of suffering, a plea you cannot answer. It feels personal, even though you have no idea who or what is making the sound. You find yourself flinching, wincing with every muffled shriek, feeling a terrible, helpless empathy for the unseen victim. It's like listening to a radio station that only broadcasts people screaming for help, and you can't change the channel. Historians still argue whether medieval accounts of buildings being haunted or producing strange, disembodied sounds were early attempts to explain natural phenomena like wind whistling through crevices, animal activity within structures, or even settling buildings through a supernatural lens, or if they occasionally documented genuine, if perhaps mundane, and later forgotten events like people becoming accidentally trapped or deliberately concealed within structures. Was this monastery experiencing a natural acoustic anomaly, amplified by collective fear? Or was there a terrible hidden truth echoing from its walls? The moral dilemma is crushing. You hear someone suffering, perhaps dying, just feet away, separated by stone you cannot breach. You feel a primal urge to help, to break through the wall to rescue them. But the walls are the monastery. They are its strength, its identity. To simply start smashing holes in them is unthinkable, sacrilegious, and practically impossible without tools you don't possess and permission you haven't been given. And even if you could, where do you start? The sounds shift, elusive, coming from different places at different times. It's like trying to catch smoke. The fear transforms into a heavy, debilitating presence. The The sacred silence of the monastery is utterly destroyed, replaced by the constant low-grade hum of anxiety and the terrible punctuation of screams. Sleep is almost impossible. You lie awake listening, imagining the unseen struggle, the desperate attempts to break free, the slow descent into despair of the person trapped within the stone. You picture them in the dark, cold void, their hands raw from clawing at stone, their voice hoarse from screaming utterly alone, except for the distant sound of monastic life that offers no help. The communal meals become tense affairs, eaten in near silence, everyone listening. Prayer is a struggle, your mind constantly distracted by the suffering echoing from the walls around you. Work in the scriptorium is interrupted by sudden gasps and cries that make your hands shake, ruining delicate manuscript pages. The cloister walk, once a place of peaceful meditation, is now fraught with dread, never knowing when a scream might erupt from the stone beside you. The trapped screams are reaching a climax. They are more frequent, more desperate, louder than ever before, even muffled by the stone. They speak of dwindling hope, of increasing pain, of a final terrible struggle. It's clear to everyone now whatever is trapped in the walls is reaching the end of its endurance. The sounds are no longer just spooky noises. They are a death knell, a final agonizing plea before silence falls. And the awful realization dawns on you if the sounds stop. It won't be because the trapped person was rescued. It will be because they are gone. The monastery built as a sanctuary might be about to become a tomb. The dread deepens, turning cold and heavy in your gut. You know with terrible certainty that the time for passive listening is over. Something has to be done, and soon before the screams fade into eternal silence. The shift isn't sudden, like a switch being flipped, but gradual, insidious. The desperate screams, the frantic scraping, the heavy thuds, they don't vanish in a single dramatic moment. Instead, they begin to fade. It starts subtly. A shriek is less sharp, a groan less forceful. The desperate clawing sounds diminish in intensity, becoming weaker, slower, like a mechanism winding down. The intervals between the sounds lengthen. The constant background hum of suffering that had permeated the monastery begins to dissipate, leaving behind an unnerving quiet. The monks don't immediately notice the complete cessation. For a time, you are all still primed to hear the terrible noises, your ears straining in the silence, anticipating the next cry. Every creak of the ancient timbers, every rustle of a robe makes you flinch, expecting it to be the prelude to another scream. But the screams don't come. The scraping is gone. The thuds have ceased. An hour passes in almost unbearable silence. Then two, then a whole liturgical period. It's not the peaceful, sacred silence of prayer or meditation. It's a heavy, oppressive silence, pregnant with the awful knowledge of what its arrival implies. It's the silence that follows the storm, but in this case, the storm was a human voice trapped in agony. The air in the monastery feels different, colder, heavier, as if the very walls are holding their breath. The dread hasn't lifted. It has merely transformed from the fear of active suffering into the chilling certainty of a terrible end. The abbot calls another meeting, this time not in the chapter house, but perhaps in the refectory, where the space feels less formal, less haunted by the recent echoes. The atmosphere is somber, defeated. No one needs to voice the obvious. The silence is the loudest thing in the room. Brothers, the abbot says, his voice barely above a whisper. The sounds, they have ceased. A collective sigh heavy with sorrow and fear answers him. We could not help them. He continues, his gaze fixed on the worn surface of the table. Whoever they were, we could not reach them in time. The feeling of failure is profound, a bitter taste in your mouth. You listen to someone die slowly and terribly separated by mere feet of stone, and you were utterly powerless to intervene. The frustration you felt earlier, the desire to smash through the walls, is now compounded by regret and a terrible sense of helplessness. It's like watching a boat sink just offshore, hearing the cries for help, but having no way to swim to them. But despite the tragic silence, the mystery remains. What was it? Who was it? The unanswered questions gnaw at you, refusing to let you find peace. The sheer improbability of someone being trapped within the solid walls still beggars belief. Was it a ghost, a demon, or was it, as some whispered, a terrible hidden secret of the monastery's past made manifest? The monastic life, which relies so heavily on order and understanding, the divine plan is utterly disrupted by this inexplicable, horrifying event. Mainstream historical fact. While deliberate entombment as a form of punishment or confinement did occur in some historical contexts, particularly for political prisoners or heretics, it was exceptionally rare within monastic walls themselves, and certainly not a sanctioned practice for dealing with internal issues. Such an act within a religious community would have been seen as abhorrent and antithetical to monastic vows and principles. This makes the idea of a person being deliberately sealed within the walls of this monastery almost unthinkable, pushing you back towards searching for other, perhaps more mundane, but still tragic explanations. Driven by this need for understanding, or perhaps a desperate need to find some physical reality to confront, after weeks of intangible terror, the abbot sanctions a more thorough investigation. This isn't the frantic, scattered search from before. This time it's methodical, focused. They decide to examine areas where the sounds seem strongest or most frequent. The wall behind the high altar, a section of the cloister, walk a specific corner near the chapter house entrance. It's a slow, painstaking process. Monks tap the stone with small hammers, listening intently for any difference in sound. A subtle hollowness that might indicate a void behind the solid face. It takes days. Days spent listening to the endless, empty silence punctuated only by the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of hammers on stone. The dread doesn't dissipate. It merely sinks deeper, becoming a cold, permanent resident in your chest. You participate in the search, your arm aching from the repetitive motion, your heart aching with grief for the unknown victim. It feels futile, like trying to find a single drop of water in the ocean. Here's a quirky historical tidbit. Medieval monasteries, particularly older ones, were often built in phases over centuries, leading to complex, sometimes erratic architecture. Walls might enclose older structures, or later additions might incorporate earlier features in unexpected ways. It wasn't always a clean single build. Could a void exist simply due to irregular construction or a forgotten, filled-in doorway or passage that was later built over accidentally trapping someone? It's a slightly less terrifying thought than deliberate malice, but no less tragic if someone became accidentally sealed within. Then finally a difference is noted. Not by a monk tapping, but by accident. Perhaps a brother is leaning against a section of wall near the main altar during Vespers, and he notices a faint draft, or the stone feels slightly colder than the surrounding area. Or maybe someone is repairing a loose piece of plaster and discovers a small, almost invisible crack not present elsewhere. Whatever the catalyst, a specific location is identified. Tapping here produces a distinctly different sound, a duller thud, a faint echo, suggesting a space, however small, behind the stone face. The abbot is summoned. The tapping is confirmed. There is a void. It's small, perhaps only a few feet high and wide, judging by the area of the hollow sound. It's located low down near the base of the wall, tucked away almost invisibly behind the decorative stone facing. It feels impossible that sounds so loud and desperate could have come from such a small space, but the evidence is undeniable. A decision is made. With heavy hearts, they must open the wall. It's not about rescue anymore. It's about discovery, about laying the mystery to rest, about giving some dignity to the unknown soul who perished within the stone. Gathering tools, chisels, hammers, levers, they begin the slow, painstaking process of carefully removing the stones covering the void. Each stone pried loose feels like peeling back a layer of history of sorrow. The work is difficult, the mortar hard as rock. It takes hours of backbreaking labor. The small crowd of monks watches in silence, their faces grim, the air thick with anticipation and dread. You are among them, your muscles sore, your breath catching in your throat with every stone that shifts. Dust fills the air, illuminated by the flickering lamplight, adding to the sense of unreality. It feels like you are excavating a tomb, which in a terrible sense you are. As the opening widens, the darkness within the void is revealed. It's a space perhaps only 3 feet high, maybe 4 feet wide, and not very deep. Certainly not enough to stand, barely enough to crouch or curl up in. The air that escapes the void is cold, stagnant, carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of decay and something else, something mournful and final. It's a smell that chills you to the bone, a smell that speaks of confinement and death. Using lamps held aloft, the monks peer into the tiny dark space, and there curled up in the fetal position is a body. It's a human body, shrunken and still. The robes are monastic simple wool, like the ones you wear, though the color is difficult to discern in the dim light and coated in dust. The face is turned away hidden. The hands are curled inward. It's not the terrifying monster some might have feared, not a supernatural entity. It is a man, a monk, one of your brothers perhaps, or perhaps someone from a long, long time ago. Historians still argue whether accidental or deliberate entombments in walls, though rare, could account for some historical ghost stories or unexplained phenomena attributed to buildings. Was this monk deliberately put here? Was it an accident? Did he perhaps fall into a hidden cavity during construction or renovation and become trapped? The questions flood your mind, overwhelming the grim reality before you. The screams, the agony you heard came from him. From a fellow human being suffering unimaginable horror in the pitch-black darkness, sealed away by solid stone. The silence now feels even heavier, weighted down by the tangible proof of the tragedy. The void is small, claustrophobic. How long did he survive in there? How long did he scream before the silence fell? The thought is unbearable. Looking at the tiny dark space, you can almost feel the crushing weight of the stone, the suffocating darkness, the utter hopelessness of being trapped. The monks carefully, reverently retrieve the body. It is brittle light. As they turn it gently, the face is finally visible, partially obscured by matted hair and dust. It is a face you don't recognize, or perhaps one distorted beyond recognition by time and suffering. The robes offer no immediate clue to his identity. No distinguishing mark, no embroidery. He is simply the man in the wall, the source of the screams. The official explanation, the one whispered among the brothers and perhaps recorded, or perhaps not, in the monastery's chronicles, will be simple: a tragic accident. Perhaps a monk exploring a forgotten passage, or one who fell into a cavity during repair work and was accidentally sealed in before he could be found. It's the easiest explanation, to bear less terrible than deliberate cruelty, less unsettling than a haunting. It provides a semblance of order to a deeply disturbing event, but you know what you heard. You heard the progression from whimpers to screams, the desperation and the struggle. You saw the small sealed void, and you felt the crushing weight of the silence when the screams finally stopped. Whether accidental or not, this was a terrible, lonely death, witnessed only by the stone and the men who heard the suffering echoing through it. The mystery is solved, but the peace you sought is elusive. The monastery will never feel the same. The stone walls, once a symbol of security and solitude, will forever whisper of the man who screamed from within.